When a billionaire's daughter needed help, every stranger walked past except one. Hundreds of people walked right past her. A little girl, 8 years old, standing completely alone beside a moving escalator in one of the busiest airports on the East Coast, trembling, tears streaming silently down her face, clutching a small backpack like it was the only solid thing left in her world. Businessmen glanced and kept moving. Couples scrolled their phones. A gate agent walked within 4 feet of her without slowing down. Then one man stopped. He wasn't security. He wasn't airport staff. He was just a mechanic from coastal North Carolina with a quiet daughter of his own, and something in him refused to keep walking. What happened next would change 4 lives permanently. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because every week I bring you stories that will stop you in your tracks. Stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when it matters most. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. Drop a comment below and tell me what city and country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel, and it means the world to me to know you're out there. If this story moves you, hit that like button. It helps more people find us. Now let's go back to that airport. The flight board at Havenport International Airport read 2:47 p.m. when Bennett Knox first checked it, and it read the same thing at 3:15 p.m., which told him everything he needed to know about the next several hours of his life. Flight DL 1142 to Charlotte, delayed, new departure TBD. He exhaled through his nose, the way he always did when something annoyed him but wasn't worth fighting. Sadie was already looking up at him from beside his elbow, her brown eyes asking the question her 8-year-old mouth hadn't formed yet. "How long?" she asked. "Don't know yet, Bug. Are we going to miss Grandma's dinner?" "Probably not." He said it with more certainty than he felt. "Come on. Let's find seats that aren't next to a crying baby." Sadie almost smiled at that. Almost. She was a serious kid had been since she was about 4, after her mother died, as though some part of her had decided that the world required more careful attention than she'd previously given it. Bennett understood the feeling. He'd had a version of it himself. They found a pair of seats near the far end of Terminal C, close enough to the windows that Sadie could watch the ground crews work. She liked machinery, liked watching things that moved for a reason. Bennett figured she got that from him, though he'd never said so out loud. He set their carry-on under his seat, stretched his legs, and reached for the water bottle in his jacket pocket. Around them, the terminal hummed with the specific misery of delayed, travel-tired parents, restless toddlers, a man 3 rows over arguing quietly but intensely into his phone about something that sounded financial and urgent, and probably wasn't either. Bennett had done 3 overseas deployments and spent the better part of a decade in places where the air itself felt hostile. Airport delays didn't register on whatever scale he used to measure stress anymore. He was watching a 737 back slowly away from its gate when Sadie pulled on his sleeve. "Dad. That girl is crying." He followed where Sadie was looking. 40 feet away, near the base of the escalator that connected Terminal C to the main connector hall, a little girl stood alone. She wasn't throwing a fit. She wasn't calling out for anyone. She was just standing there, both hands wrapped around the straps of a small purple backpack, her shoulders drawn up almost to her ears, tears running steadily down both cheeks. She was scanning faces in the crowd, the way you scan a crowd when you've already given up on finding what you're looking for. Bennett had seen that look before, not in airports. He was on his feet before he'd consciously decided to stand. "Stay here," he told Sadie. "I want to come." He looked at her. Something in his expression must have communicated that this wasn't negotiable, because she sat back down and folded her hands in her lap. He didn't walk fast. He moved the same way he'd learned to move in tight spaces overseas, deliberate, unhurried, hands visible, nothing in his posture that might read as threat. The girl was already scared. The last thing she needed was a large man in a gray jacket bearing down on her like he had somewhere to be. He stopped about 6 feet away from her and crouched down, so his eyes were roughly at her level. "Hey," he said. "You okay?" She looked at him. Her eyes were very dark and very wide, and she had a small cut on her lower lip. It looked like she'd been biting it hard enough to bleed. She shook her head once, tight and quick. "Okay," Bennett said. "That's fair. I'm Bennett. What's your name?" She stared at him for a long moment. He didn't push. He just waited. The way he'd learned to wait, in situations where patience was the only currency that worked. "Elodie," she said finally. Her voice was thin and scraped sounding, like she'd been holding herself together for a while, and the word had cost her something. Elodie. That's a good name. He glanced back toward where Sadie was still sitting, watching them with the focused attention of a much older child. That's my daughter over there. Her name's Sadie. She's 8. How old are you? 8, yeah? Same grade then, probably. He paused. You waiting for someone? My mom. Her chin wobbled once, then steadied. I can't find her. I was right next to her, and then people were everywhere. And she was gone. How long ago? Elodie thought about it, pressing her lips together. A long time. In Bennett's experience, a long time to an 8-year-old could mean 6 minutes or 40. He didn't ask her to be more specific. He turned slightly and raised his hand toward Sadie, made a slow, deliberate gesture. Sadie understood. She picked up their bag and made her way over carefully, threading between rolling suitcases and oblivious adults. My daughter's going to come sit with us, Bennett told Elodie. Is that all right? Elodie looked at Sadie approaching, and something in her face shifted fractionally, still scared, still lost, but slightly less alone. She gave a small nod. Sadie stopped beside her father and looked at the crying girl with the direct, unvarnished appraisal that kids that age are capable of. Hi, she said, I'm Sadie, Elodie. Are you lost? Sadie, Bennett said mildly. What? She is, isn't she? Elodie actually made a sound that was almost a laugh. It broke off fast, like it surprised her, but it was there. Yeah, she said, I am, okay. Sadie sat down cross-legged on the floor beside the escalator without any fuss, as though sitting on airport floors was a normal activity. She unzipped the front pocket of her own backpack and pulled out a small bag of pretzels. Do you want some while we wait? My dad's going to find your mom. Bennett looked at his daughter for a half-second. She was already holding the pretzel bag out toward Elodie with the casual matter-of-factness of someone who had decided the logistics were someone else's problem, and she had done her part. He stood up, pulled out his phone, and walked the 8 steps to the nearest airport employee, a young woman in a blue vest, pushing an empty wheelchair, and spoke to her quietly. Within 90 seconds, the woman had radioed someone. Within 3 minutes, a security supervisor named Officer Delgado was crouching beside Elodie, speaking softly, taking down a physical description of her mother. Bennett stayed. He didn't hover. He positioned himself about 10 feet away, standing at an angle that let him watch both Elodie and the broader crowd simultaneously. Old habit. Not a conscious one. He didn't know who her mother was. He knew nothing about Elodie Voss beyond her first name and the fact that she was 8 years old and alone in a crowd of roughly 2,000 people who had each independently looked at a crying child and decided it wasn't their problem. He hadn't asked himself why he stopped. It hadn't felt like a question. 18 minutes was how long it took. He knew because he'd been counting in the loose, background way. He always counted things, breaths, exits, people who'd glanced at the girl and kept moving. 18 minutes is long when you're 8 years old, and your mother is somewhere in 200,000 square feet of terminal space, and you don't have a phone and you don't know the gate number and the adults. Around you keep streaming past like water around a rock. He watched Elodie hold herself together with the specific determination of a child who has decided that crying louder won't help. She ate 3 of Sadie's pretzels. She answered Officer Delgado's questions in a small, careful voice. She kept looking toward the main connector, toward the escalator, toward every gap in the crowd where a familiar face might appear. Sadie talked to her. Not about anything important, about a dog she'd seen in the parking garage, about a book she was reading, about whether airport pretzels were better than regular pretzels, which was a debate she appeared to have strong opinions on. Bennett heard Elodie's responses get slightly less clipped as the minutes passed. Sadie had a gift for that. He'd never figured out where she'd gotten it, because it wasn't from him. He was scanning the crowd for the 3rd time when he saw her. She came off the escalator at speed, moving the way people move when fear has burned through every social restraint that normally governs how fast you walk in public. She was tall, maybe 5'8", dressed in a gray blazer and dark slacks that looked like she'd put them on for something important that morning, her dark hair loose and slightly disordered. She had a phone pressed to her ear with one hand and the other held slightly out, fingers spread, like she was ready to grab something or someone at any moment. Her eyes moved across the crowd in a sweep that was too controlled to be random. She was searching methodically, not panicking wildly, but underneath the control her face was a very particular kind of white. Bennett had seen that face on people who'd just watched their helicopter go down. "Officer," he said quietly. Delgado looked up. Bennett tilted his head toward the escalator. The officer radioed immediately. The woman must have heard something in her earpiece, because she turned sharply, scanned, and found them in about 4 seconds. She came across the terminal in a near run, and it would be incorrect to call what happened next elegant, because it wasn't. Aveline Voss dropped to both knees on a dirty airport floor in a blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. And she grabbed her daughter so hard that Elodie made a muffled sound that was half laugh and half sob, and Aveline said something against the top of her daughter's head that wasn't a full sentence, just pieces of one. Repeated, the way people talk when the words don't matter as much as the sound of your own voice confirming that everything is still okay. It lasted maybe 20 seconds. Then Elodie pulled back enough to look up at her mother's face, and she pointed. He stayed with me, Mom. Aveline turned. She saw Bennett Knox the way you see someone when you're still shaking internally, and your vision has that over-focused quality that adrenaline produces. She took him in the gray jacket, the worn work boots, the quiet posture, the way he was standing with his arms loose at his sides, not expecting anything from her, not moving toward her. She stood up, one hand still holding Elodie's shoulder, and walked toward him. Her eyes were still bright with the residue of the last 18 minutes. Bennett noticed that she hadn't fully let go of Elodie. She probably didn't realize it. You stayed with her, she said. It came out less like gratitude and more like she was confirming a fact that still felt improbable. She was alone, he said. Aveline looked at him for a moment like that answer required more processing than she had bandwidth for right now. Then she reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and produced a business card, cream-colored, minimal, the kind that costs actual money to print. You don't have to do that, Bennett said. She stopped. I haven't said what I'd like to do yet. I know, he said it without attitude, just level. But whatever it is, you don't have to. She needed someone to stop. I stopped. That's all. Aveline Voss had built a company from a pitch deck and $40,000 in a shared workspace in Atlanta. She had sat across negotiating tables from people who had spent 20 years learning how to be intimidating. She was not easily unsettled by directness. But there was something in how this man said, that's all that she couldn't immediately categorize. She looked at his daughter, who was standing beside him now, the pretzel bag still in her hand, watching the reunion with the careful attention of a child who has been around more adult difficulty than children usually are. Sadie gave Elodie a small wave. Elodie, still holding her mother's hand, waved back. At least I'd actually just like to know she got back to you safe, Bennett said, which she did so. He reached down and took Sadie's free hand. Have a good flight. He was turning away not rudely, just finished when it started. Later, Bennett would think about the geometry of it, how he'd been positioned, how he'd kept that old habit of never fully facing away from a crowd, of always maintaining sight lines he couldn't explain the need for anymore, because the professional life that had built them was 8 years gone. He heard it before he saw it. Not a gunshot, nothing that clean. It was the specific sound of a confrontation tipping past the point where words are working. A sharp collision of voices followed by the thud of something hard against something soft, followed by screaming. Not one person screaming. The cascade kind, spreading outward from a point source, which meant people near it could see it, and people farther out could only hear the alarm in other people's voices, and were already moving away from whatever it was. The man came through the gap in the crowd at a run. He was mid-40s, business casual, carry-on abandoned somewhere behind him. His eyes had the flat, displaced look of someone who had been cornered by something, a call he'd received, news he couldn't process, a crisis that had eaten through whatever held him together, and who had decided that movement was the only available response. He'd shoved a TSA employee into a stanchion near the security checkpoint. The employee was down. The crowd had split around him the way crowds split, instinctively, which had opened a direct path toward the gate seating area where roughly 60 people were clustered. Bennett moved. He didn't think about it later in those terms. What he did was, he assessed the vector, the man's speed, the crowd density on either side, the nearest available structural cover. And he moved Aveline first because she was closest to the path, one hand on her shoulder steering her backward. Then Elodie because Elodie was attached to Aveline's hand. And then he said to Sadie in the exact tone he used when he meant a thing completely. With me, and Sadie was. There was a service counter 7 feet to their left, solid construction, fixed to the floor, the kind of built thing that doesn't move when you need it not to. He had all 4 of them behind it before the man had covered 20 feet. Then Bennett turned. He said something to a man in his mid-50s, standing frozen near the counter, said it in the specific voice that expects to be obeyed, and the man turned and began moving other people toward the emergency exit on the east wall, without entirely knowing why he'd agreed so quickly. Two of them were already partway there, before the full shape of the situation had registered. Officer Delgado came through the crowd at a run. Bennett was already alongside him. What happened in the next 40 seconds was not dramatic in the way airport incidents appear in movies, with bodies flying and glass breaking. It was faster than that, and smaller than that. Two men who both knew how to move, taking the angles, removing the options, until the man had nowhere left to go that wasn't surrender. No one else was hurt. The shoved TSA employee was helped up by two passengers. The screaming died down to the stunned murmur that follows the end of something. It was over. Aveline emerged from behind the counter with Elodie pressed against her side. She found Bennett standing at the edge of the contained situation, slightly winded, speaking quietly with Officer Delgado. His jacket was twisted at the shoulder from where something had caught it. There was a redness starting on the back of his right forearm. He was checking on Sadie, crouched down in front of her, asking her something, watching her face. Sadie said something back. He nodded, rested his hand briefly on top of her head, then stood. Aveline looked at him. This was the same man who had, 20 minutes ago, quietly crouched on an airport floor to talk to a lost child so he wouldn't frighten her. The same man who had just refused her business card. She'd spent years hiring people at significant expense to be exactly what this man had just been, instinctively for free, in a scenario nobody had planned for. "Who are you?" she said. It wasn't small talk. It wasn't even entirely rhetorical. Bennett looked at her. He was still checking the crowd peripherally, old machinery running whether he wanted it to or not. "Just a mechanic," he said. Aveline Voss had made her fortune by being excellent at knowing when someone was lying to her. He wasn't lying. She could see that clearly. He genuinely believed that's what he was, which raised a question she couldn't quite let go of. Even later, when the terminal had calmed down and the reports were being filed, and her own security team had arrived in a controlled fury of earpieces and dark jackets, what kind of mechanic moves like that? Officer Delgado's report took 40 minutes to complete, which meant Bennett and Sadie missed the rescheduled flight entirely. He found that out while standing at the edge of a small airport security office that smelled like recycled air and old coffee, watching a man in a uniform type information into a computer with the focused inefficiency of someone bliss to keyboard in a different era. Sadie sat beside him on a plastic chair with her book open in her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. She was watching Elodie, who was sitting across the narrow room beside her mother. Aveline Voss had not fallen apart. Bennett noticed that. She'd come close, he'd seen it in those first seconds, when she'd found Elodie, when the controlled surface cracked just enough to show what was underneath, but she'd closed it back up fast. Now she sat with her daughter pressed against her side and her phone in her hand, working through what looked like a significant number of messages with the mechanical focus of someone who uses productivity as a coping mechanism. He recognized the pattern. He'd done something similar himself after Rachel died, staying busy until busy became the only gear he knew how to use. "Your name came up," Delgado said, coming to stand beside Bennett near the door. Bennett looked at him. "When I ran the incident report. There's a supervisor here, guy named Hargrove. Spent 8 years in naval intelligence before he moved to airport security management." Delgado paused. "He recognized your name." "People have common names," Bennett said. Delgado gave him a look that said he wasn't buying it, but wasn't going to push. "He wants to say hello. That's all. Tell him I said hello back." Delgado almost smiled. "He said you'd probably say something like that." Bennett said nothing. Across the room, Elodie had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder, with the sudden total collapse that kids manage when the adrenaline finally drains out, like a phone hitting zero battery. Aveline had stopped working her phone. She was just holding her daughter, one hand resting lightly on Elodie's hair, staring at the middle distance with the expression of someone doing quiet arithmetic on how differently the day could have ended. Sadie appeared at Bennett's elbow. "Are we getting a hotel?" "Probably." "Can we get the one with the pool?" "We'll see what's available, Bug." "That means no. That means we'll see what's available." She returned to her chair without further argument, which was how Bennett knew she was more tired than she was letting on. Sadie only stopped pushing when she was genuinely running out of fuel. He was about to ask Delgado about the rebooking process when Aveline stood up carefully, so as not to wake Elodie, lowering her gently to the chair, with a jacket folded underneath her head, and crossed the room toward him. She moved quietly for someone who, Bennett was beginning to understand, occupied a very loud professional world. "I owe you an apology," she said. He looked at her. "For what?" "For the business card." She said it without the defensive edge people usually put on apologies that cost them something. That was a reflex. "Something bad happens, I reach for a way to solve it financially. It's a habit I've had since I was about 24, and it's not always a good one." Bennett considered that. "You don't owe me an apology for it. I'm giving you one anyway." She glanced toward where Elodie was sleeping. "She doesn't go anywhere without at least one member of my security team. We were supposed to be met at the gate, but the flight delay there was a miscommunication about the new arrival time, and my team was at the wrong terminal." She stopped. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand I'm not careless with her. I'm not the mother who turns her back in a crowd." "I didn't think you were," Bennett said, and he meant it. He'd watched enough genuinely neglectful parents in his years as a father to know what indifference looked like. What he'd seen on Aveline's face crossing that terminal wasn't indifference. It was the particular horror of a careful person who had done everything right and had something go wrong anyway. She said, "You didn't touch her," Aveline said. "When you first approached her, that you stayed back." She was scared. Moving too fast toward a scared kid doesn't help. Aveline was quiet for a moment. "My security director, the man who was supposed to be there, he's been with me for 6 years. He's competent." "But I don't think competent would have thought about that." Bennett didn't respond to that. It wasn't a question. "Can I at least ask what you do?" she said. "You told me mechanic. Marine mechanic. I run a repair shop in Havenport, down the coast. And before that?" He looked at her steadily. She held the look without flinching, which told him she'd already heard something from Delgado, or Hargrove, or someone in the 30 minutes since the incident had been contained. "Before that I did something else," he said. "Navy." He didn't confirm or deny it. He looked across the room at Sadie, who had finally given up the pretense of reading and was now asleep in her chair with her chin tucked to her chest, which was going to give her a stiff neck she'd complain about for 2 days. "She looks like you," Aveline said, following his gaze. "Around the eyes." "Her mother's smile, though," he said. It came out before he'd decided to say it, and he didn't add anything to it. Aveline didn't press. She just nodded once, and he appreciated that more than he would have appreciated almost anything else she could have done in that moment. "I'm going to have my assistant rebook your flights," she said. "Before you say no, not as payment. Not as anything except the fact that my people are going to be on the phone with the airline for the next hour anyway, and adding 2 names to a request takes about 30 seconds. You can say no to the upgrade. You can't tell me it's not faster than standing in the rebooking line." Bennett looked at the line in question, visible through the office window. It wrapped back past the gate and disappeared around a corner. "Fine," he said. Something very small shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one. "Thank you," she said, "for stopping." He nodded once. She went back to her daughter. Bennett sat down and stretched his legs out and watched the ceiling for a while, listening to the muted airport noise beyond the office door, and tried not to think about the fact that something about this day had started to feel like it had weight to it, not in a way he could explain or would have tried to explain, just the sense that the geometry of things had shifted slightly, the way a room changes when a door you've kept closed for a long time opens an inch. He dismissed the feeling. He was tired and his arm hurt where it had been wrenched during the incident, and he had a daughter who needed a hotel room with a pool, apparently, though that wasn't happening tonight. He closed his eyes. He opened them again almost immediately, because he'd spent 8 years sleeping lightly, and the habit wasn't going anywhere. He watched Elodie sleeping in her mother's jacket. He watched Sadie with her chin on her chest. He thought about nothing in particular for a while. Then Aveline's phone rang, and she answered it, and her face changed. It was the kind of change that happened fast and went deep. Bennett saw it from across the room, the way the controlled professional surface she maintained, like a skilled poker player, suddenly had something wrong underneath it. A structural issue, the face of someone receiving information that doesn't fit the shape of any category they'd prepared for. She spoke for maybe 90 seconds. Short answers. Her voice was level, but her free hand had gone flat on the table in front of her, pressing down like she needed the solidity of it. She ended the call. She sat still for a moment, long enough that Bennett started paying more attention. Then she looked up and found Delgado and said, in a voice that was very controlled and very quiet, "I need to speak with your supervisor. Right now." Delgado looked at her face and didn't ask why. What came out over the next 40 minutes in that small office, between Aveline and a supervisor named Hargrove, who turned out to be a large, gray-templed man with the contained energy of someone who'd done serious work in a previous life, was not what any of them had expected the day to produce. The airport's security camera system had captured footage that the initial incident review focused, understandably, on the man who'd shoved the TSA employee had not yet fully processed. But someone on Aveline's own security team, now on site and running their own review, had flagged it. 42 minutes before Elodie was found standing alone by the escalator, the cameras showed Elodie and Aveline together at a coffee kiosk near the main connector. The crowd was dense. A connecting flight had just arrived, flooding the walkway with several hundred additional passengers. In the footage, a man in a gray jacket, not Bennett's gray jacket, a different one, moved into position near the kiosks in a way that read as coincidental until you watched it 3 times and understood it wasn't. He positioned himself between Elodie and Aveline with the crowd as cover. Then he maneuvered, gradually and without apparent urgency, in a direction that was neither toward a gate nor toward any logical destination for a traveler. Elodie had not wandered away. She'd been redirected. Not grabbed, not dragged, nothing that would have drawn attention or triggered screaming. Just quietly and deliberately moved by someone who understood crowd dynamics and knew that in a dense moving group, separation happens fast and looks accidental and takes a long time for the person left behind to even register as a crisis rather than a temporary gap. Aveline's security director, the one who'd been at the wrong terminal, had received incorrect information about her flight delay status. The revised arrival window he'd been given came from within the company's internal system. "That's not a hack," Bennett said. Everyone in the room looked at him. He'd been standing near the door and hadn't said anything for the last 20 minutes. A hack leaves traces. Someone would have flagged unusual access. He looked at Hargrove. That information came from someone with legitimate credentials. Someone who already had access. Hargrove studied him. "That's a reasonable read." "It's not a read. It's what the evidence suggests." Bennett looked at Aveline. "Someone on your team knew your travel schedule. The terminal, the flight, the delay. They fed bad information to your security director to put him at the wrong terminal. And they had someone at the airport who knew which child was yours." The room was quiet. Aveline's face was doing something complicated. She was working through it the way you work through something that hits at the place where your professional life and your personal life intersect, where the thing you built to give your daughter a good life has become the thing that put your daughter in danger. 6 years, she said. Not to anyone in particular. "What?" Hargrove said. "My security director has been with me 6 years. She stopped. "He was the one who gave the wrong terminal information to the substitute team." "That doesn't necessarily mean—" "It means I need to know," she said. The softness was gone from her voice now, not replaced by anger, replaced by something quieter and more purposeful than anger. "I need to know everything." Hargrove nodded. He picked up his radio. Bennett looked across the room at where Elodie was still sleeping in the chair, completely unaware that the world had gotten substantially more complicated around her in the last hour. The jacket had slipped a little off her shoulder. He thought about Sadie at that age, before Rachel died, when the world was still a place that could be trusted to stay where you put it. He thought about the man in the gray jacket on the security footage, moving through a crowd with the specific economy of someone who'd done that kind of thing before. He thought about the geometry of the day, the delayed flight, the dense crowd, the wrong terminal, the misdirection, the number of moving parts that had to be in place. This wasn't impulsive. This was planned, Mr. Knox, Hargrove said. Bennett looked at him. Hargrove had a way of looking at people that suggested he'd spent a lot of years doing it professionally. "I served under Captain Marcus Webb, 2nd Naval Special Warfare Group. He mentioned your name once, about 4 years ago, in a context I won't go into." "Okay," Bennett said. "I just want you to know I know who I'm talking to." "I'm a marine mechanic," Bennett said. "Who used to be something else." "Yes," Hargrove said. "That's exactly right." He said it without irony. Aveline looked between the two men. She was clearly running calculations about what she didn't know and deciding whether to ask. She decided not to, for now, which told Bennett she was smarter about picking her moments than most people he dealt with in professional settings. "What do you need from me?" Bennett asked Hargrove. "Right now? Nothing. This is a law enforcement matter and a corporate security matter, and we have people for both." He paused. "But I want to ask you something informally." Bennett waited. The incident at the checkpoint, the man who went through the crowd. Do you think it was connected? Bennett had been thinking about this since the moment the crowd split and the man came through the gap. He'd thought about the timing of it, how it had happened roughly 20 minutes after Elodie was found, when Aveline was present and beginning to ask questions, when attention was starting to coalesce around the child and her mother. I think it's worth asking, Bennett said, carefully. A man has a breakdown in a busy airport, it happens. People crack under pressure in public all the time. But the timing of it and the direction he was moving when the crowd split. He stopped. I'm not saying yes. I'm saying it warrants looking at. Hargrove nodded slowly. That's also my read. I'm not law enforcement anymore, Bennett said. I'm not anything official. I'm just a guy who missed his flight. I know, Hargrove said. I'm not asking you to be anything official. The conversation ended there, because Elodie woke up, and when a child wakes up disoriented in an unfamiliar room, the room reorganizes itself around that fact immediately. Mom. Her voice was rough from sleep, and she sat up too fast and grabbed for Aveline's arm. I'm here. Aveline was already beside her. I'm right here, Elodie. Where are we? Still at the airport. We're going to leave soon, okay? We're going to the hotel. Elodie processed this, looking around the room with a careful, slow assessment of someone waking up in an unfamiliar place and checking the inventory of what's familiar. She found Sadie, who was also now awake and watching from across the room, and something in Elodie's face settled slightly. Hi, Sadie said. Hi, Elodie said, a pause. My neck hurts, Sadie offered. Mine too, Sadie considered this. Airport chairs are terrible. Really terrible, Elodie agreed. Aveline looked at her daughter for a long moment with the expression of a person who has just been reminded why everything else is secondary. Then she looked at Bennett. We're staying at the Havenport Meridian tonight, she said. My assistant has rebooked you on the first flight tomorrow. If that doesn't work. It works, Bennett said. Good. She reached into her jacket pocket and produced a card. Not the business card this time, something handwritten on a piece of hotel notepaper, a phone number. This is my personal cell. Not my assistant's line, not my office. Mine, she held it out. He took it. In case something comes up tonight, she said. With the investigation, or anything else. Bennett looked at the number. Then he put it in his shirt pocket. Your flight's going to be fine, he said. Keep Elodie close tonight. I will. She said it the way people say things they've said before but mean differently now. I don't plan to let her out of my sight for approximately the next decade. That'll get complicated when she's 16, Sadie offered from across the room. Aveline looked at her. A real smile, this time not large, but actual. I'll deal with 16 when we get there. My dad says that about a lot of things, Sadie said. She looked at Bennett. You do, I do, he agreed. The small office, temporarily, felt almost ordinary. A tired father, 2 8-year-olds complaining about their necks, a woman in a wrinkled blazer who was managing more than anyone in the room fully understood yet. For 30 seconds, the weight of the day lifted fractionally, the way weight sometimes does when children are talking about mundane things, and you are reminded that mundane things still exist. Then Hargrove's radio crackled, and he stepped into the hallway, and the weight came back. The hotel that Aveline's assistant had booked for Bennett and Sadie did not have a pool. Sadie looked at the room, 2 queen beds, a window overlooking a parking structure, a television bolted to the wall, and appeared to arrive at a private conclusion about the injustice of this, which she chose not to vocalize, which was, again, how Bennett knew she was operating on empty. She brushed her teeth. She asked if they could call Grandma. He told her it was too late. She got into bed without further negotiation. He sat on the edge of his bed in the dark for a while, listening to Sadie's breathing slow and even out. The room had that specific hotel quiet that's not actually quiet, the HVAC running, the distant sound of someone else's television, ice machine down the hall cycling on and off. He'd slept in worse places, many worse places. But sleep wasn't what was happening right now. He thought about the man in the gray jacket on the security footage, the deliberate way he'd moved, the planning it implied. He thought about Aveline in that office, doing the arithmetic on who in her inner circle could have given someone her travel schedule, her terminal, her daughter's face. 6 years of professional loyalty running through that calculation and coming up with possibilities she didn't want to reach. He thought about Elodie standing by the escalator, both hands on the straps of her purple backpack, holding herself together with everything she had. He thought, briefly and without meaning to, about how Aveline had said, "I'm right here," when Elodie woke up confused. The speed of it, no gap between the question and the answer, and something about that precision of response, the immediate, Unconditional presence of it had felt familiar in a way that sat uncomfortably in his chest, because it reminded him of Rachel. Rachel, who had also moved without hesitation toward whatever needed her. He'd been 8 years not thinking about that too directly. He reached for his phone. There were no messages from Hargrove. There was one from his neighbor Jim Prater, asking if he wanted the Evinrude order held until he got back, which he did. There was nothing from anyone that required the particular kind of attention was currently incapable of giving. He lay back on the bed, the ice machine cycled on. He thought about the man in the gray jacket and the timing of the man at the checkpoint and the wrong terminal and the number of pieces that had to move correctly for any of it to work. He thought about Aveline's face when she'd gotten the phone call, the way her free hand had gone flat on the table. He thought about Elodie, asleep and safe, somewhere in this hotel. He thought about what Hargrove had not said directly, but had clearly meant that this wasn't finished, that whatever had started today at Havenport International had a shape that extended beyond the airport, and that the man in the gray jacket was connected to something larger, and that somewhere in Aveline Voss's professional world, a person with access and motive had looked at an 8-year-old girl and decided she was a useful piece. The ice machine cycled off. Bennett stared at the ceiling. He would go home tomorrow. He would pick up the Evinrude order. He would repair the Pearson 32 that had been on his lift for 2 weeks with a cracked fuel line. He would make dinner and help Sadie with whatever she was behind on, in reading and watch 30 minutes of television and go to sleep at 10 because he was up at 5:30. That was the life he'd built. It was a good life. It was a quiet life. It was the life he'd chosen when he came back from a place he didn't talk about and buried his wife, and decided that Sadie needed a father who came home reliably and repaired things that were fixable and did not spend his days in situations where the cost of a mistake was measured in ways he didn't want to think about. He'd made a promise to himself about that, clearly and explicitly, 8 years ago. He meant it. He closed his eyes. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. Unknown number, but the area code was local, someone using the hotel system, probably, or a staff line. He answered, "Mr. Knox." It was Hargrove. His voice had the specific stripped-down quality of someone who had moved from official channels to something adjacent to them. "I'm sorry to call this late." "It's fine," Bennett said. He was already sitting up. "The man from the checkpoint today, Marcus Teller, 43, out of Charlotte, he's cooperating. He had a breakdown, legitimate. Lost his job 3 weeks ago, family situation, it was real and it wasn't connected." A pause. "But here's what is." Bennett waited. We pulled the full camera sequence from the connector hall. The man in the gray jacket, we have a partial plate on a vehicle he entered in the parking structure. It ran through a shell company that took us about 2 hours to trace. Hargrove paused again, and this pause was different from the first one. "Mr. Knox, the shell company's registered address is a subsidiary of a holding company, which is controlled by a board member of Aveline Voss's own company." The room was quiet. "Not the security director," Hargrove said. "Someone above him. Someone who's been in her orbit for a long time." Bennett said nothing for a moment. "She doesn't know yet," Hargrove said. "We're working with corporate investigators to verify before we tell her. But I thought you should know. In case." "In case what?" Bennett said. A long pause. "In case you were thinking about going home tomorrow and putting this behind you." Bennett looked at the ceiling. "I'm a marine mechanic," he said. "Yes," Hargrove said. "You keep saying that." The call ended. Bennett set his phone down on the nightstand. Across the room, Sadie slept with the absolute faith of a child who trusts that the people around her are handling whatever needs handling. He sat with that for a while. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and took out the piece of hotel notepaper with Aveline's handwritten number on it, and he set it on the nightstand next to his phone, and he looked at both of them for a long moment before he turned off the lamp. He didn't sleep well. He hadn't expected to. He was up at 5:15, which was earlier than even his usual, and he sat at the small desk by the window drinking bad hotel coffee and watching the parking structure outside go from dark to gray while Sadie slept. He hadn't made any decisions during the night. That wasn't entirely accurate. He'd made one, which was to stop pretending he wasn't going to make one, which was its own kind of decision. He knew himself well enough to know that the conversation with Hargrove had closed a door he'd been trying to keep open. The door that said, "This isn't your problem. You stopped for a scared kid and that was the right thing to do. And now the right thing to do is go home and let people whose job this is handle what comes next." The problem was the shell company, the board member. The person with access to Aveline's inner calendar who had looked at an 8-year-old girl and decided she was leverage. Bennett had spent a decade in environments where people made that kind of calculation, where children were leverage, where families were pressure points, where the vulnerability of the people you loved most was the most reliable weapon anyone could use against you. He'd operated in those environments because someone had to, and because he was good at it, and because he'd believed, at 24 and 26 and 29, that the work mattered enough to justify the cost of doing it. Then the cost had come due in ways he hadn't anticipated. And he'd come home, and he'd meant it. He was still sitting with his coffee at 5:50 when his phone rang. It was Aveline. He answered before the second ring. "You're up early. I haven't slept." Her voice was level, but had the particular texture of someone who had been awake, doing difficult things for several hours. "I got the call from the investigators at 2 in the morning. About the shell company." "I know. Hargrove called me." A pause. "He called you last night. He wanted me to know." Another pause longer. "Why would he want you to know?" Bennett looked out the window at the gray parking structure. "I think he was being careful." Careful how? Careful about making sure the information existed somewhere outside the official channels. In case the official channels turned out to be compromised. He let that sit for a moment. He doesn't know the full shape of it yet. Neither do I. Neither do you. But if someone on your board was behind this, it raises questions about who else knew. The line was quiet for long enough that he checked to make sure the call was still connected. "His name is Gerald Sutton," Aveline said finally. "He's been on my board for 4 years. He came in with a Series C investment, took a seat, and has been She stopped. "He's been difficult. He's had opinions about the direction of the company that I've disagreed with and overruled. I didn't think he was..." Another stop. "I didn't think he would do this." "People who do this kind of thing don't usually advertise it in advance," Bennett said. "No," a short, humorless sound that was almost a laugh. "I suppose they don't." "What does he want?" Bennett said. "Sutton. What's the disagreement about?" "A merger. There's a company, Drayden Systems, that's been trying to acquire us for about 18 months. The deal would effectively dissolve my company's independent structure. I'd have a seat at a much larger table and significantly less control. My board has been split on it. Sutton has been pushing hard for the merger, and you've been blocking it. I control 53% of the voting shares. As long as I'm in a position to exercise them, yes." Bennett thought about this. The shape of it was becoming clearer. The way shapes become clear in low light, when you've learned to let your eyes adjust instead of reaching for a flashlight. Someone had tried to take Elodie, not for ransom in the traditional sense, not for money delivered to an account somewhere, for leverage, for the specific targeted leverage of a mother whose child is in danger and who might, under that pressure, make decisions she would never make otherwise. Sign something, agree to something, give something up. It was a strategy that required a particular kind of coldness to conceive of. "How much is the merger worth?" Bennett said. "To Sutton's personal holdings? Roughly 400 million. Bennett said nothing. "I know," Aveline said. "I've been sitting here since 2 in the morning trying to make it feel real, and it still doesn't." "It will," Syed said. "Give it a few more hours." "That's not comforting." "It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to be accurate." He paused. "Where's Elodie?" "Asleep. I've had 2 members of my security team outside the door since midnight." A pause. "The right 2 this time. People I trust. Good." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "What does law enforcement say?" "The corporate investigators are working with the FBI now. It moved to federal jurisdiction last night because of the interstate elements. They want me to stay in Havenport through today, possibly tomorrow. There are people they want to talk to." She paused. "I imagine they want to talk to you as well." "Probably. Will you talk to them?" "Of course," he said. "I'll tell them what I saw." "And what about..." She stopped, seemed to recalibrate, then said, "I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to give me a direct answer." "All right. Hargrove told me who you are, what you were, specifically. He didn't give me details, but he was clear enough." A pause. "I'm not going to ask you to do something official or to take a role you've left behind, but I want to know if you think my daughter is still in danger." Bennett looked at the ceiling. He thought about the man in the gray jacket, the shell company, a board member who'd been willing to use a child as a chess piece. He thought about what exposure meant in a situation like this, whether the people involved would calculate that their best option was to retreat cleanly, or whether they would decide that a loose end was more dangerous than a next move. "I think Sutton knows his exposure increased significantly when Elodie came back to you safe," Bennett said. The plan failed. Whatever he was going to use as leverage didn't materialize. Now he's looking at potential federal charges and he knows there's an investigation. Which means what? Which means he's either going to lawyer up and go quiet and try to minimize his legal exposure, or he's going to make a calculation that his best option is to increase the pressure before the investigation closes around him. He paused. I don't know which one he'll choose. I don't know him. I do, Aveline said quietly. I've sat across a table from him for 4 years. Another pause. He's not the kind of man who goes quiet. Bennett nodded to himself. Then yes, I think you should treat the next 48 hours carefully. 48 hours, she repeated. Why 48? Because that's usually how long it takes for a situation like this to either escalate or collapse. After that, the investigation has enough mass that individual actors can't redirect it anymore. He stopped. I could be wrong. I've been out of this for 8 years. But your instinct says 48. My instinct says keep Elodie close and trust very few people. A long silence. Would you? She stopped again. He could hear her working through how to ask something she clearly found difficult to ask. Would you be willing to stay in Havenport one more day? Not in any official capacity. Just Elodie asks about Sadie, and I think I would sleep better knowing that you were... She seemed to hear herself and stopped. That's a strange thing to ask a man I met yesterday. It's not strange, Bennett said, given yesterday. Is that a yes? He looked toward the bed where Sadie was still sleeping. He thought about the Pearson 32 on his lift, the cracked fuel line, Jim Prater holding the Evinrude order. He thought about the quiet life in the coastal town, the small shop, the deliberate ordinariness he'd built around his daughter, like a set of walls he trusted. I'll make a call, he said. Check on some things at home. Then yes. Thank you, she said. Just that no elaboration, no professional qualification. It came out simply, and it sounded like she meant it simply, which was different from how she said most things. They agreed to meet at 9 in the hotel restaurant. He put the phone down and looked at the parking structure for another minute. Then he called Jim Prater, who answered on the second ring, despite it being 6 in the morning, because Jim had been a commercial fisherman for 30 years and had the sleep schedule to prove it. Hold the order, Bennett said. And if anyone asks, I'm still traveling. Jim, who had known Bennett for 6 years and had long since stopped asking questions he understood he wouldn't get complete answers to, said, sure thing, and hung up. Sadie took the news that they were staying one more day with the careful neutrality of a child who has learned that her father does not make decisions arbitrarily, but also does not always explain them fully. She asked 2 questions, whether there was breakfast and whether Elodie would be there. Bennett told her yes to both, which resolved the situation. The hotel restaurant was the kind of place that served eggs 4 ways and had small bottles of Tabasco on every table and played soft jazz at a volume that suggested someone had decided atmosphere was important but hadn't fully committed to it. Aveline was already there when they arrived, at a corner table with a sightline to both entrances, which Bennett noted and which told him either she'd thought about it herself or someone had told her to. Elodie was beside her, working through a plate of pancakes with the focused energy of a child who has processed yesterday's fear and arrived at the other side of it hungry. Sadie, Elodie said, with the straightforward pleasure of an 8-year-old who doesn't perform enthusiasm but means it.
Hi.
Sadie slid into the chair across from her with her own straightforward directness. Did you sleep okay? My neck still hurts. Mine stopped, Elodie said. Lucky. Aveline looked at Bennett as he sat down. She looked like someone who had made it through a difficult night on willpower and coffee and had decided that falling apart was not currently on the schedule. Her eyes had a tiredness under them that foundation wasn't quite covering, and her hair, which had been loose and slightly disordered the night before, was pulled back now in a way that read as someone getting themselves organized for what came next. The FBI wants to meet at 11, she said, keeping her voice low under the girls' conversation. At a field office location, they're not identifying ahead of time for obvious reasons. My attorney will be there. Okay, Bennett said. They'll want to talk to you separately. I told them you'd cooperate. I will. He picked up the coffee that a server had already poured. What about Sutton? Has anyone made contact with him? Not yet. My understanding is they want the full chain of evidence before they approach him. If he knows the investigation is coming, before they have everything documented, there's... She paused, looking for the right word. Flight risk, Bennett said. Yes. She looked at her own coffee. His family has a house in Portugal. He's traveled there often enough in the last year that it wouldn't look unusual. A pause. He sent me a text message last night, asking how I was after the terrible incident at the airport. Expressing concern, Bennett looked at her. I know, she said. I didn't respond. Good. It took everything I had not to respond. I can imagine. She looked at him for a moment. Can you? Have you ever known someone was responsible for something you couldn't say you knew yet? He thought about that honestly. Yes. How did you handle it? Badly, he said, for a while. And then I focused on what could be done instead of what had already been done. He paused. The second approach worked better. Aveline nodded slowly. The restaurant moved around them, a family with a toddler at the next table, a businessman reading something on a tablet, the soft jazz working through something instrumental that nobody was listening to. The girls had moved from neck injuries to a discussion about pancakes versus waffles that appeared to be generating real intellectual engagement. Elodie's father, Aveline said, without preamble. She was looking at the table when she said it, not at him. He's not in the picture. He left when she was 2. He lives in Seattle now, remarried, sends birthday cards that arrive late. A pause. I'm not telling you for sympathy. I'm telling you because she doesn't have a male presence in her life who just stops and notices her. The way you did yesterday. She looked up. And I've been watching her this morning, and she's lighter than she should be after what happened yesterday. Because Sadie is here and you're here, and somehow that means something to her that I didn't anticipate. Bennett looked at Elodie, who was demonstrating something with her fork to Sadie, some elaborate point about the structural superiority of waffles, gesturing with the authority of someone making an important case. Kids find solid ground wherever it exists, he said. She found some yesterday. She's using it. Is that what happened with Sadie? Aveline said. After her mother? He looked at her. It was a direct question, and it had crossed a line into territory he didn't usually let people into. And she seemed to know it because she said, I'm sorry, it's fine, he said. And it was he found, which surprised him slightly. Yes. Sadie went through a period where she was very anchored to structure, routine. She wanted things to be the same every day, because same meant predictable and predictable meant safe. She grew out of it, mostly. He paused. She still likes to know what's happening. Hence, the question about whether Elodie would be at breakfast. He looked at her. You heard that. I was already watching the door when you came in. A small pause. She's remarkable, your daughter. She talked to Elodie yesterday like it was simple. Like making another person feel less alone was just something you did. She's had practice, Bennett said. Not always by choice. Aveline seemed to understand what he meant by that, without requiring elaboration. She nodded once and looked down at her coffee, and they sat for a moment in the particular quiet of 2 people who have arrived at a point of mutual understanding without having planned to. Then Bennett's phone buzzed. It was Hargrove. He read the message under the table, and his face did not change, and he put the phone back in his pocket. He looked at Aveline. Eat something before 11, he said. You're going to need it. She read his face the way she'd been reading faces across tables for years. What happened? Hargrove. He'll give you the details when he can. A pause. The man in the gray jacket. They found him. Where? Bennett looked at her steadily. He was trying to leave the country. Charlotte Douglas International, booked on a flight to Lisbon. Aveline's jaw tightened. Lisbon, Portugal. The same country where Gerald Sutton had a house. He had a phone, Bennett said. Multiple calls to a number that traces back to a communications account registered in Sutton's wife's name. The FBI moved faster than anyone expected. He paused. Sutton was picked up at his home in Charlotte at 5:45 this morning. The restaurant continued around them. The toddler at the next table was working through a bowl of fruit with impressive determination. The jazz moved through something that might have been a standard, unrecognizable, under the soft focus arrangement. Aveline's hand was flat on the table again, the same gesture he'd seen in the security office the night before, pressing down into solid surface. It's over, she said. Her voice was very controlled. The acute part. There's still going to be a long legal process. But the immediate... He stopped. Yes. The immediate part is over. She nodded. She nodded again. Then she picked up her coffee cup and set it back down, because her hand wasn't entirely steady, and she knew it and chose to wait rather than push through it. Hey, Elodie said from across the table. Mom, are waffles better than pancakes? Aveline looked at her daughter. Something moved across her face, not the controlled professional expression, not the calculated steadiness she'd maintained. Through 20 hours of an increasingly terrible situation, something rawer and more genuine than either, the unguarded face of a mother looking at a child she'd been scared of losing. Waffles, she said. Definitely waffles. See, Elodie said to Sadie with the satisfaction of a verdict confirmed. My dad makes better pancakes than any waffle. Sadie said, unimpressed by the ruling. You haven't had a waffle from the right place, Elodie countered. Where's the right place? Elodie thought about it. I don't know yet, but it exists. Bennett looked at Aveline. She was still watching Elodie, and the hand on the table had relaxed. She's going to be all right, he said, quietly, just for her. I know, Aveline said. She's tougher than I am. I doubt that. You haven't known me very long. No, he said, but I watched you yesterday. She looked at him. Most people, he said, in your position, with your resources, would have handed the crisis to their security team and their attorneys the moment they had Elodie back. Would have put professional distance between themselves and every uncomfortable part of it. He paused. You sat in a small airport security office for 3 hours and asked direct questions and made difficult calls and did not pretend you weren't affected when you clearly were. He picked up his coffee. That's not soft. Aveline was quiet for a moment. My security director, she said finally. The one who was misdirected to the wrong terminal. Marcus. He's been with me since I had 12 employees and we were all working out of a shared office in Atlanta. A pause. The investigators cleared him last night. He was manipulated, not complicit. He doesn't know yet that Sutton was behind it. She looked at the table. I have to tell him today. That's going to be a hard conversation.
Yes.
She exhaled. He's going to feel like he failed. He's going to carry it, probably. But that's his to carry, not yours. You can be honest with him and give him the facts and let him process it in his own time. That's all you can do. Is that what you do? With things you carry? He looked at her for a moment sometimes. When I get it right. And when you don't. I repair boat engines at 5 a.m, he said. Something in her face shifted, not quite a smile, but in that direction, the specific expression of someone who recognizes a coping mechanism because they have their own version of it. I run financial models at 2 a.m, she said. For companies I'm not even considering acquiring. Just to have something to do with my hands. That's more productive than what I do. It's really not, she said. I've acquired 3 companies I didn't actually want because I'd talked myself into them at 2 a.m. He looked at her. I'm kidding, she said, then mostly. The FBI meeting lasted 2.5 hours. Bennett gave his account of events to a pair of agents in a conference room that smelled like New Carpet Special Agent Diane Reyes and a younger agent named Polk, who took notes and asked follow-up questions with the methodical energy of someone who had been taught that thoroughness was the most important thing. Bennett answered what he knew and was clear about what he didn't, and declined twice politely to speculate beyond what he'd directly observed. Reyes was watching him with the professional attention of someone who was doing math about him. You moved quickly in the terminal incident, she said, near the end. The man at the checkpoint. I had a sightline on the situation, Bennett said. Airport security footage shows your response time was significantly faster than the officers present. Officers have procedures, Bennett said. I didn't have procedures. I just had proximity. Reyes nodded in the way that meant she'd noted the answer and found it incomplete and was going to let it go for now. Were you aware that the checkpoint incident and the Elodie Voss incident were potentially connected at the time you responded? No, Bennett said. I wasn't. So you moved on instinct. I moved on what was in front of me, he said. Someone was about to get hurt. I was close. Those were the relevant facts. Reyes was quiet for a moment. Mr. Knox, we're going to need your contact information, and we may need to follow up. That's fine. One more thing. She looked at him with the direct attention of someone who has learned that the last question in an interview is sometimes the most informative. Is there anything you observed at Havenport Airport yesterday that you haven't told us? Bennett thought about this honestly. He thought about the geometry of the crowd, the gray jacket, the timing of events, the things Hargrove had told him on the phone the night before, the sense he'd had standing in the security office, that the shape of it was larger than what was visible. I think the man in the gray jacket had done this kind of thing before, he said. The way he moved through the crowd, the efficiency of it. That's an observation, not evidence. But it suggests Sutton didn't use someone local for this. He used someone with a history. Reyes wrote something. That's everything, Bennett said. Aveline was in the lobby when he came out, sitting in one of the low chairs near the window with her phone in her hand. She stood when she saw him. How was it? Fine, he said. Thorough. Same. She glanced toward the elevator bank. The girls are upstairs. My security team is with them. They found a movie. A pause. Elodie FaceTimed me from the room to inform me that Sadie had never seen The Princess Diaries and that this was a situation requiring immediate correction. Bennett processed this. Sadie's never seen that. That's true. Elodie is treating it as a personal mission. Sadie will appreciate that eventually, he said. She resists things before she accepts them. It's a pattern. Elodie is the opposite. She decides immediately and completely. Aveline looked toward the window. Outside, Heavenport's main street was doing its ordinary midday business, a couple walking a dog, a delivery truck double parked, the flat blue suggestion of the ocean, visible between buildings at the end of the block. I think that's why they work, the two of them. As a pair. Bennett said nothing, but he thought she was right. I called Marcus, Aveline said. Told him everything. He took it the way I expected, a long pause. He apologized to me. 19 times. I counted. What did you tell him? I told him to stop apologizing and take a few days and then come back because I needed him. She looked at the floor. I meant it. I know. She looked up at him. Sutton's attorney made contact an hour ago. He's going to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for various things his attorney is going to argue about for the next year. A pause. It's not satisfying. The way this works is never satisfying. No, Bennett agreed. The legal process is rarely the part that feels like resolution. What's the part that feels like resolution? He thought about it. Different for everyone. For me, it's usually, he stopped. It's usually when the people I was worried about are clearly okay. When I can see it directly and it's not a report or a legal outcome or someone telling me it's fine. When I can actually see it. She looked at him for a moment. She's upstairs watching a movie about a princess, Bennett said, and she called you to tell you about it. That's what okay looks like for an 8-year-old. Something moved through Aveline's face. It was brief and she managed it quickly, but he saw it the specific exhaustion of 24 hours of fear and crisis, and holding it together, finally finding a release point. I know, she said. Her voice was slightly less even than usual. I know. He didn't say anything. He didn't try to wrap it up neatly or pivot to practical matters. He just stood there while she pulled herself back together. Because sometimes that was the most useful thing you could offer, just being a steady presence, while someone processed something that couldn't be processed quickly. After a moment, she squared her shoulders in a way that was probably automatic by now, the physical gesture of someone who had rebuilt herself from zero more than once and knew what the first step felt like. Tell me about your shop, she said. The marina. What do you actually do all day? He looked at her, caught slightly off guard by the turn. What, your life, she said. Tell me about your actual daily life. I've been in crisis management for 24 hours, and I want to hear about something normal. She looked at him with an expression that was direct and a little raw and completely without pretense. Please. So he did. He told her about the Pearson 32 with the cracked fuel line that had been on his lift for 2 weeks. He told her about the commercial fishermen who came in at the end of the season with engines that had been pushed past what engines were designed to do. He told her about Sadie doing homework on the workbench while he worked because the drive to and from school ate into useful afternoon time, and this was more efficient, and how Sadie had developed strong opinions about diesel engine maintenance that she deployed in conversations with his clients in ways that were both embarrassing and impressive. He told her about the harbor seals that showed up at the dock most mornings in October, reliable as a calendar. Aveline listened. She didn't check her phone. She asked questions that showed she was actually following, not networking questions, not power broker questions, genuine questions about how things worked and what they felt like. When he described the sound an engine makes when it's running the way it should, after you've rebuilt it from a stripped-out mess, she said, that must be satisfying, and meant it in the way people mean things when they're not performing interest. It is, he said. And he meant it too, not as a substitute for something else he'd lost, not as a consolation, but genuinely. The work was good work. It was work that required his full attention and produced something real and fixable and his. He'd made peace with that a long time ago. I run a company, Aveline said. I build things. I built it from nothing. And I love it. She paused. But I have not once, in 8 years of running it, felt the thing you just described. The sound of something working the way it should. She looked at the window. I feel success. I feel relief. I feel the next problem. But that specific thing. She shook her head slightly. You might be in the wrong industry, Bennett said. She looked at him sharply. He realized it had come out more directly than he'd intended, and he waited for her to bristle. She didn't. She thought about it seriously. Or I need to be better about stopping, she said finally. The way you stopped. Yesterday. In the airport. He considered that. Maybe both things, she almost smiled. Maybe both things, she agreed. The lobby was quiet around them. The jazz from the restaurant had been replaced by silence and the distant sound of the elevator, and, somewhere upstairs, Two 8-year-olds watching a movie about a girl who discovered she was a princess, which only one of them had seen before, but which both of them were right now completely absorbed by. "I'd like to come to Havenport," Aveline said. "When this is all—" She gestured vaguely at the space around them, which stood in for everything the last 24 hours had contained. "When it's done. The investigation and the legal process and all of it. I'd like to bring Elodie and come see your marina." Bennett looked at her. "Elodie talks about the harbor seals," she added. "I told her about them when you were describing she was on the phone, FaceTiming me, and she heard." A pause. "She has opinions about harbor seals." "What kind of opinions?" "Strong ones," Aveline said. "She's done research. She'll tell you about it at length if you give her an opening." He thought about Elodie with her purple backpack and her trembling chin, and the way she'd accepted Sadie's pretzels and slowly come back to herself in that small, bad-smelling airport office. "Come whenever you want," he said. "There's room on the dock." "I'll hold you to that," she said. Not lightly. In the way she said things when she meant them seriously. "I know you will," he said. Outside the ordinary life of the town continued the dog walker, the delivery truck, the flat blue line of the ocean between buildings. Inside, something that had begun with a frightened child standing alone by an escalator had arrived somewhere neither of them had expected, on a path neither of them had chosen, through a series of events that had been terrible in ways that were real and were not yet fully finished. But Elodie was upstairs watching a movie, and Sadie was with her. And whatever came next in the long, complicated aftermath of the last 24 hours, the federal case, the board restructuring, the conversations that would need to be had, the things that would need to be rebuilt, those were problems with the shape of the future, not the present. For right now, in the lobby of an ordinary hotel in Havenport, North Carolina, with the jazz gone quiet and the window showing an ordinary afternoon, that was enough to sit with. Bennett Knox, who had spent a decade learning to assess threats, and a subsequent decade learning to let them go when they were genuinely over, let himself sit with it for a while. The lobby chair was uncomfortable. The hotel coffee was bad. His arm still ached where it had been wrenched in the terminal. He didn't move. Neither did she. They left Havenport the following morning, Aveline and Elodie back to Atlanta, Bennett and Sadie finally catching the flight to Charlotte that they'd missed 2 days earlier. Sadie slept against the window for the entire 40-minute flight, which told Bennett last 2 days had cost her more than she'd let on. She was like him in that way. She ran on reserve long after other people would have admitted they were empty, and then she crashed completely when the situation finally permitted it. He watched her sleep and thought about the Pearson 32 waiting on his lift and the normalcy of the work week ahead, and told himself that the weight he was feeling in his chest was simply tiredness. He wasn't entirely convinced. Aveline had given him her personal number. He had given her his. They had stood in the hotel parking lot while their respective cars arrived and had said goodbye with the particular awkwardness of two people who were trying to be appropriate about something that felt like more than appropriate warranted. Elodie had hugged Sadie twice. Sadie had accepted the second hug with slightly more grace than the first, which was progress. Harbor seals, Elodie had said to Bennett, very seriously, before getting into the car. "Come whenever you want," he'd said. She'd nodded like they'd closed a business deal. He thought about that on the plane. About how Elodie moved through the world with a kind of forthright certainty that reminded him, in structure if not in style, of her mother, the directness of it, the absence of performance. Aveline Voss had built an empire and sat across tables from people who had spent careers learning to be intimidating. And underneath all of that, when you stripped away the blazer and the business card reflex and the controlled surface, what was left was a person who asked direct questions and meant direct things, and didn't dress up what she wanted in language designed to protect her from the answer. He'd met very few people like that in his life. Fewer than 5 if he was counting carefully. Rachel had been one. He stopped that thought where it was and watched the clouds outside the window until the plane began its descent. The first week back was ordinary in the way he needed it to be. He finished the Pearson 32, replaced the fuel line, and the related hardware that had been showing wear, and had it back in the water by Wednesday. The commercial fisherman who owned it, a weathered man named Pete Dalloway, who had been coming to Bennett's shop for 4 years and communicated primarily in grunts and appreciative silences, ran a hand along the gunwale when he came to pick it up, and said good, which from Pete was effusive praise. He helped Sadie with a book report on a novel about a girl who discovers she can talk to animals, which Sadie found implausible but was willing to engage with analytically. He made dinners that were unremarkable and nutritious. He watched the harbor seals show up at the dock on Thursday morning, 3 of them, right on schedule, and thought briefly of Elodie's opinions on the subject, and then went inside and made coffee. He didn't text Aveline. He thought about it twice, once on Tuesday, when something Sadie said reminded him of something Elodie had said. And once on Thursday with the seals, and both times he put the phone down and found something useful to do with his hands instead. It wasn't a principled decision exactly. It was more that he didn't know what the right thing to say was, and he'd learned a long time ago that when he didn't know what the right thing was, saying nothing was almost always better than saying the wrong thing. On Friday afternoon, she texted him, "Elodie wants me to ask whether the harbor seals have names. She says she's prepared to name them if they don't." He looked at the message for a moment, standing in his shop with grease on his hands and a half-disassembled outboard motor on the bench in front of him. "They don't have official names," he wrote back. "Sadie calls the big one Gerald." A pause of about 2 minutes. "Elodie says Gerald is a terrible name for a seal and she can do better. She wants to know if she can submit alternatives." He almost smiled at that. "Tell her submissions are open," he wrote. 3 minutes later, his phone showed a voice memo from an unknown number, Elodie's. Apparently that was 45 seconds, of a very serious 8-year-old explaining, in considerable detail, why the name Barnacle was both thematically appropriate and phonetically satisfying for a harbor seal of Gerald's size and apparent dignity. The argument was structured, and the delivery was completely deadpan. He played it twice. Then he went back to the outboard motor. But he was smiling now, which was not something he'd planned for the afternoon, and which he noticed without examining too closely. The call from Special Agent Reyes came the following Tuesday. He was on the dock when it came in, watching Pete Dalloway's Pearson 32 move out through the harbor mouth with the specific satisfaction of watching something he'd fixed work the way it was supposed to. "The case is moving faster than we anticipated," Reyes said. "Sutton's cooperation has been more substantial than his attorney initially indicated it would be. He gave us the full picture." "Which is what?" Bennett said. "The merger Drayden Systems has been a pressure point for about a year. Sutton's personal holdings were significantly leveraged against the deal going through. When Ms. Voss continued blocking it, he made contact with an intermediary connected to Drayden's board." A pause. "The original plan was financial pressure, trying to find irregularities in her company's accounts that could be used as leverage in a regulatory complaint. When that produced nothing usable, the plan escalated. To Elodie," Bennett said. "Yes." Reyes' voice was professional and level, but there was something underneath it that was not. "The man in the gray jacket, his name is Derek Foss, 41. 2 prior arrests in Europe under different jurisdictions, both charges related to coercion and corporate espionage. He was not going to harm the child. The plan, according to Sutton, was a 48-hour disappearance, long enough to demonstrate capability, long enough to get Aveline Voss to a table where she'd sign the merger agreement under duress." Bennett stood on the dock and looked at the harbor and said nothing. "Mr. Knox," Reyes said, "I want you to understand that your intervention at the airport, both with the child and with the checkpoint incident, materially altered the outcome of this situation. If Elodie Voss had left that airport with Fossey, the calculus would have been very different." "I understand," he said. "I'm not saying this to compliment you. I'm saying it as a factual matter so you have the complete picture." "I appreciate that. One more thing." A brief pause. "The checkpoint incident, the man who caused the disturbance. Marcus Teller. We were wrong about him. Not wrong that his breakdown was real, it was, but wrong about the timing of it. He was approached by Fossey's associate 4 days before the airport incident. He was paid $300 to be at that terminal and to not cause a specific incident, but to be present and agitated in a way that might create a distraction if one became necessary." A pause. He didn't know what he was part of. He needed money. He agreed to do something he was told was a publicity stunt for a reality show, and he showed up. When he actually broke down in the terminal, it was real. But his presence there wasn't coincidental. Bennett processed this. The distraction, the crowd splitting, the path that had opened toward the gate seating area. He thought about where Aveline and Elodie had been standing when it happened, and where they would have been standing if he hadn't already moved them. "The timing was tight," he said. "If Fossey's associate used the distraction as cover for a second approach." "Yes," Reyes said. "We believe that was the contingency plan. If the original misdirection hadn't worked, if Elodie had been found too quickly, there was a secondary window built around the checkpoint distraction." A pause. You closed that window when you moved them behind the counter. He didn't say anything. I thought you should know the full picture, Reyes said again. The case will take time to move through the courts, but the criminal exposure for Sutton and Foss is substantial. Ms. Voss's legal team is also pursuing civil action through the board. A pause. You'll likely be called as a witness. I want to give you advance notice so it doesn't catch you off guard. I figured, he said. Thank you for the call. Thank you for stopping, Reyes said. And she said it the same way Aveline had said it, not as a professional courtesy, but as a human being who had spent 2 days looking at security footage and case files and had arrived at a clear understanding of what stopping had meant. He ended the call and stood on the dock for a while. The harbor moved in its ordinary way around him. A pelican landed on a piling 20 feet out and regarded him with the prehistoric indifference of a bird that has been doing this longer than anyone's been watching. The Pearson 32 was gone around the harbor mouth now, just a white shape diminishing against the blue. He thought about a 48-hour disappearance. He thought about what that would have done to Aveline. He thought about Elodie standing by the escalator, with her hands on her backpack straps, holding herself together, waiting for an adult to stop. He thought about the 600 people who had walked past her. He went back inside and picked up his phone. Barnacle is a strong name, he wrote to Aveline. Tell her I'll put it to the herd. A pause. She wants voting rights in the process, Aveline wrote back. She's very serious about this. How serious? She made a slide. He stared at that for a moment. A slide, 2 slides. There's a comparison chart. He sat down on his workbench stool and looked at the ceiling and laughed, a real one, short and genuine, the kind that arrives before you have time to decide whether it's appropriate. He hadn't done that in a while. He noticed it the way you notice something that's been absent long enough, that its return is slightly surprising. Tell her the committee meets in October, he wrote, when the seals are back at full strength. She's marking her calendar, Aveline wrote. Then, after a pause, how are you? He looked at the question. Fine, he almost wrote. He'd been writing fine to that question for 8 years. Better than last week, he wrote instead. Reyes called. The full picture is significant, I know. She called me too. A pause. Are you okay with all of it? He thought about the word okay. About what it meant to be okay with the knowledge that a man had planned a 48-hour disappearance for an 8-year-old girl as a business maneuver. About what it meant to be okay with the contingency plan and the timing and the specific chain of decisions that had put him in the right terminal at the right moment to close the window. Working on it, he wrote. You? Same, she wrote. Then I fired 3 board members this week. Not just Sutton. 2 others who knew something was wrong and said nothing because the merger was in their financial interest. A pause. My attorney says I may not have the legal basis to fire all 3. I told him to find me the legal basis. He smiled at that. How'd that go? He found it, she wrote. He's a good attorney. Sounds like it. A longer pause. Bennett. She hadn't used his name in a text before. I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that no is a completely acceptable answer, and it won't change anything. He waited. There's a security infrastructure review I need to conduct for my company. Full audit physical security, personnel vetting protocols, travel security procedures, communication systems. My internal team is too close to what happened to be objective, and I don't trust an outside firm I don't know. A pause. Would you be willing to consult on it? Not to run it. Not to join my company. Just to look at what we have and tell me honestly where the gaps are. Another pause. I'll pay your going rate, whatever that is. I can also negotiate in harbor seal naming rights, but that might complicate the committee process. He read it twice. He thought about the Pearson 32, the outboard motor on the bench, Pete Dalloway's grunt of approval, the harbor seals on the dock at 5:30 in the morning, the quiet life he'd built deliberately and maintained deliberately and lived inside deliberately for 8 years. He thought about the security footage he'd described to Reyes, the man in the gray jacket, the deliberate positioning, the crowd as cover. He thought about the gaps in Aveline's security infrastructure that had made all of it possible, the single point of failure in the communication system, the lack of verification protocols for travel schedule changes, the years of trusting people without building independent checks. He knew exactly what those gaps were. He'd cataloged them automatically, the way he'd cataloged exit routes and crowd density and structural cover in the terminal. The machinery ran whether he wanted it to or not. He'd accepted that a long time ago. Send me what you have, he wrote. The current protocols. I'll look at them. That's not a no, she wrote. It's not a yes yet either. Let me see what you have. Fair, she wrote. Give me 2 days to compile it. The documentation arrived in 48 hours, as promised a secure file transfer through her company's system. 112 pages of security protocols, personnel vetting standards, physical access procedures, and communications infrastructure diagrams. He read it at his kitchen table after Sadie went to bed, 2 nights in a row, with a legal pad beside him and a pen he kept recapping and uncapping. By the end of the second night, he had 4 pages of notes and a very clear picture of a security infrastructure that had been built by people who were competent at the operational level and had not thought carefully enough about the insider threat problem. The systems were designed to keep things out. They had not been designed to account for the possibility that the threat was already inside. He called her on the 3rd morning. "Your vetting protocols haven't been substantively updated in 3 years," he said. "That's where you start." "Good morning to you too," she said. Her voice had the warm, slightly rueful quality of someone who has been expecting a particular kind of directness and is confirmed in their expectation. "Good morning. Your vetting protocols, I heard you. 3 years." A pause. "Is that bad? In your industry, with your profile and the kind of financial stakes your decisions involve, yes. People's circumstances change. Financial pressures change. A person who was a clean hire 3 years ago may have developed vulnerabilities since then that would make them susceptible to the kind of approach Sutton used." He looked at his legal pad. "You also have a single point of failure problem in your travel communication system. Any change to your schedule should require verification through at least 2 independent channels before it propagates to your security team. What you had was a system where one person in one department could update the master schedule, and that update flowed automatically to everyone." Marcus verified against the system, she said. "The system was wrong." "Exactly. He trusted the system, and the system had been manipulated. You need a layer above the system." A pause. "What does that look like, practically?" He talked her through it for 40 minutes, not in generalities, but in specifics. The kind of specifics that come from having spent a decade in environments where a communications failure meant something worse than a misconnection. She asked good questions. She didn't ask them to seem engaged. She asked them because she was actually following the logic and wanted to understand where it broke down and where it held. At one point she said, "This is going to cost significantly more to implement than what we have now." And he said, "Yes." And she said, "I'm not objecting, I'm noting it." And he said, "I know." And they kept going. When they finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You're good at this," she said. Not as flattery. As an observation. "I was trained for it," he said. "You were trained for combat," she said. "This is different. The underlying problem is the same," he said. "Finding where the system is vulnerable before someone who wants to exploit it does." A pause. "The application is different. The thinking is the same. Will you put the recommendations in writing? Formally? Yes. And will you be willing to be involved in the implementation? Not full-time. Not a role. Just as a resource I can call when I have questions." He looked at his legal pad. 4 pages of notes. The engine of that old assessment machinery that had never switched off, running clearly and without rust on a problem it recognized. "Yeah," he said. "I can do that. Thank you." A pause. "Bennett." "What?" "Thank you for not making me argue for it." He thought about that. "You've been argued with a lot." "Constantly," she said. "About everything, my whole professional life." A pause. "It gets tiring." "I'll add that to the list of things to fix in your organization," he said. A CEO who's being argued with about every decision is a CEO whose board structure has a problem. She made the sound that was almost a laugh. "Put it in writing. I'll use it in the next board meeting." "Don't use it in the next board meeting. You have 3 fewer board members than you did last week, and the remaining ones are going to be jumpy. Give it a quarter." "A quarter," she repeated. "You think in timelines. Everyone thinks in timelines. Some people are just less honest about it." A longer pause. "How's Sadie?" "Good. She's reading a book about a girl who talks to animals. She thinks it's implausible, but is engaging with it analytically." "That sounds exactly right. Elodie?" "Better every day. She's sleeping in her own room again, which is she'd been sleeping in mine since the airport. Last night she went to her own room without me saying anything." A pause. "Small things." "Not small," Bennett said. "That's the real indicator. The legal process is noise. That's signal." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly right." October arrived the way it always did on the North Carolina coast, abruptly, the summer heat cutting off like someone had thrown a switch replaced by the kind of clear, cool air that made everything look sharper than it had in months. The harbor seals came back to the dock with their usual unhurried punctuality, 4 of them this time, including the large one Sadie had named Gerald. Bennett was on the dock at 6 in the morning with his coffee when Aveline's car pulled into the parking area above the marina. He'd known she was coming. They'd arranged it 2 weeks earlier, a weekend trip, no particular agenda beyond the harbor seals and the fact that Elodie had been asking about it with increasing frequency. He had fixed up the guest cabin at the back of his property, not fixed up in any elaborate way, just cleaned it and put fresh sheets on the beds and made sure the heat was working, because the nights were cold now. Sadie had, unprompted, drawn a small sign on a piece of cardboard that said "Welcome Elodie and Aveline" and taped it to the cabin door, which Bennett had left there. Elodie got out of the car first and stood at the top of the dock ramp and looked at the harbor with the wide-open attention of a child who has been anticipating something and is now confirming it against the reality. Then she saw the seals. She came down the ramp faster than was strictly safe on the marine-grade wood and arrived at the dock level and stopped about 8 feet from the water's edge, looking at the 4 seals on the floating platform below with an expression that was pure, undisguised wonder. "Barnacle," she said, in a low and reverent voice, to the largest one. The seal looked at her with the flat, ancient indifference of a species that has been in the ocean since before anyone's been naming things, and then it looked away. "He acknowledged it," Elodie said. "He really didn't," Sadie said, appearing beside Bennett. "He did. It was subtle." Sadie looked at Bennett. He raised one shoulder slightly, which she correctly interpreted as "let her have it." Aveline came down the ramp carrying a weekend bag and wearing, for the first time since Bennett had known her, clothes that had nothing professional about them, jeans and a flannel shirt and boots, with mud already on them from the parking area, her hair loose. She looked different, not less capable, just less armored. He noticed it and didn't say anything about it. "She's been talking about this for 3 weeks, Aveline said, stopping beside him, and watching Elodie begin a soft, serious monologue directed at the seals from a respectful distance. "Sadie's been pretending she wasn't excited," Bennett said. "She was. They're good for each other," Aveline said. "Those two." "Yeah." They stood on the dock and watched their daughters. The harbor moved around them. The clean, cold October light on the water, the distant sound of a commercial vessel coming in through the mouth. The seals on the platform below were indifferent and magnificent and smelled strongly of fish, which Elodie appeared to regard as part of their charm. "How's the security review going?" Bennett asked. Not because he didn't know they'd had 3 calls about it in the last 2 weeks, but because it was something to say that wasn't the thing he wasn't saying yet. "The vetting protocol update is almost complete. The communications verification system went live Tuesday." A pause. Marcus ran the first drill. 2 false schedule updates, both caught at the verification layer. A pause. He cried a little. "In private, he told me about it afterward. That's a good sign. Not the crying, the telling you." "I know." She looked at the water. "He's back. Properly back, I mean. Not just physically present." A pause. "He said something to me this week that I've been thinking about. He said that the thing that stayed with him most isn't the mistake with the terminal. It's the 18 minutes. The idea that Elodie was alone for 18 minutes while 200 people walked past her." She paused. "He said he keeps thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been there." Bennett looked at the water. "I keep thinking about it too," she said. Not in a dark way. In the honest way she said most things. "I've built an entire professional life on being self-sufficient, on not needing anyone to step in, on being the person who handles things." A pause. "And the most important thing that happened to my daughter happened because a stranger stopped." "A stranger with a kid the same age," Bennett said. Sadie made it easier for Elodie to trust the situation. "You were going to stop regardless," Aveline said. "With or without Sadie." He didn't contradict that because it was true. "I've been trying to understand what made you different from the other 600 people," she said. "Not the training, not the background. Something before that." She looked at him. "What is it?" He thought about it honestly. He thought about 24-year-old Bennett Knox at Bud S. Wesh, learning that the difference between completing something and quitting wasn't physical. He thought about deployments and the specific, hard-won understanding that what held a team together wasn't skill or fitness or tactics, but the willingness of each person to be someone others could count on. He thought about Rachel, who had moved toward whatever needed her without waiting to be asked, and how he'd understood that about her, before he'd understood that he loved her. He thought about standing in Terminal C at Havenport International Airport, tired and delayed, watching a crowd of people do the math on a frightened child, and conclude that the math wasn't their problem. "I don't know," he said. "Didn't feel like a decision. It felt like the obvious next thing. That's what I can't figure out, she said. How to make that the obvious next thing for more people. You can't make it anything for other people, he said. You can only be it yourself and hope the people around you catch it. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the dock, where Elodie was now seated cross-legged on the weathered wood, approximately 4 feet from the edge, conducting what appeared to be a detailed naming ceremony for all 4 seals, with Sadie serving as reluctant but increasingly invested witness. That one's name is already Gerald, Sadie was saying. Gerald is getting a middle name, Elodie said firmly. Gerald Barnacle, it's hyphenated. There are precedents. That's not how names work. It's how these names work. Bennett looked at Aveline. She was watching the girls with the same expression he'd seen on her face in the hotel lobby when she'd said, "I'm right here," that unguarded, unconditional presence that had no performance in it. "You're good with her," he said. "Elodie, the way you parent." She looked at him sharply, half expecting the qualifier, the but that usually followed a sentence like that. He didn't have one. He'd meant it straight. "It doesn't feel like good," she said. "It feels like constant improvisation." "That's the same thing," he said. She looked at him again. The October light was doing something to the water behind her, turning it a shade of blue that didn't have a name, and she was looking at him with an expression that he recognized because he'd been avoiding looking at it clearly for the last several weeks, the expression of someone who has arrived at a feeling they hadn't planned on and isn't sure yet what to do with it. He was familiar with the expression because he'd been wearing a version of it himself. "Bennett," she said, "yeah. I'm going to say something and I want you to tell me if I've read this wrong." He waited. "I didn't come this weekend because of the harbor seals," she said. "I mean, Elodie did. But She stopped. "I came because for the last 6 weeks, the conversations I have with you are the ones I look forward to most. And I've been trying to decide if that's just proximity and shared experience and gratitude for what you did in the airport, or whether it's something I should actually pay attention to." She looked at him steadily. "So I'm asking you directly. Because that's the only way I know how to ask things." He'd known the question was coming for at least 3 weeks. He'd been carrying the answer for roughly the same amount of time, turning it over the way you turn over something that requires careful handling, making sure he was being honest with himself about what it was and what it wasn't. Rachel had been gone for 8 years. He had loved her completely and lost her completely, and spent the time since building a life around the loss in a way that worked for him, and worked for Sadie, and was real, and was good, and was also, if he was being honest, deliberately narrowed in certain directions. The narrowing had made sense once. He wasn't sure it still did. "You didn't read it wrong," he said. She held his gaze. "I don't know what this is yet," he said, "or what it's supposed to be. I'm not good at—" He stopped, found a more honest version of it. "I'm out of practice with this. I have another stop. 8 years is a long time." "I know," she said. She made a small rueful gesture with her hand. "I'm not exactly practiced. Elodie's father left when she was 2, and I've spent the time since building a company and raising her and not—" She paused. "I've been alone by design. It felt safer." "Same," he said. "Yes," she said. "I thought so." They stood on the dock with their daughters 10 feet away, conducting constitutional debates about seal nomenclature in the clear October air, and the harbor moved around them. And the seals were magnificently indifferent, and the blue water had no name for its color, and neither of them said anything else for a moment, because neither of them needed to. Then Elodie said, without looking up from her negotiation, "Mom, Gerald Barnacle is looking at you." "He's not," Sadie said. "He is. He's looking at both of them." A pause. "He approves." "He's a seal, Elodie. He's a very perceptive seal," Elodie said with finality. Aveline looked at Bennett. He looked back at her. "She's very perceptive too," Aveline said, quietly, so only he could hear it. "Yeah," he said. "She is." He reached down and picked up his coffee from the dock post where he'd set it when the car arrived. It was cold now, but he drank it anyway, because it gave him something to do with his hands, while he adjusted to the feeling of something he'd kept closed for a long time beginning, carefully and without fanfare, to open. Gerald Barnacle slipped off the platform and into the harbor with a practiced ease that suggested he had somewhere to be, and had been ready to leave for several minutes. The other 3 followed. Elodie made a sound of protest and then immediately reclassified it as a dignified departure. The dock was quieter without them. Nobody moved to go inside for a while. The weekend didn't end on Sunday the way weekends usually end. Aveline had booked a return flight for Sunday afternoon, and Bennett had driven her, and Elodie to the airport Havenport Regional, smaller and quieter than the international terminal where all of this had started, which was not lost on either of them, and Elodie had hugged Sadie for a long time at the departure gate, and Sadie had hugged back with both arms, which she didn't do with most people, and then Aveline had looked at Bennett across the top of their daughters' heads, and something had passed between them that didn't require language. "I'll call you about the communications audit follow-up," she said. "I know," he said. She almost smiled. "That's not entirely why I'll call." "I know that too," he said. She picked up her bag. "Bennett." "Yeah. I'm glad you missed your flight," she said. 6 weeks ago, at the airport. He looked at her. The departure gate noise moved around them, the boarding announcements, the rolling suitcases, the specific orchestrated chaos of people going somewhere. He thought about the delayed flight board at 2:47 p.m. and then again at 3:15 p.m. and about sitting down in Terminal C and about Sadie pulling on his sleeve and saying, "That girl is crying." "Me too," he said. "Get home safe." She nodded once and went through the gate. Elodie turned at the last moment and waved at Sadie with the full-arm enthusiasm of a child who has not yet learned to be restrained about things she means. Sadie waved back in the same way. Then they were gone. On the drive back, Sadie was quiet for the first 10 minutes, which was her processing interval. Bennett left it alone. "Dad," she said finally, somewhere on Route 17, the flat coastal scrub scrolling past on both sides. "Yeah. Are they going to come back?" He looked at the road. "Yeah," he said. "I think they are." Sadie was quiet for another mile. "Okay," she said. Just that. The way she said things when she decided something was acceptable and had filed it accordingly. He kept driving. The October sun was low and sharp and turned the roadside grass, a color somewhere between gold and brown, that didn't have a name but that he associated with this stretch of coast in this season, the specific quality of afternoon light in a place he'd chosen to stay in, because it was beautiful in ways that didn't demand attention. He thought about what Aveline had said on the dock. "I came because the conversations I have with you are the ones I look forward to most." He turned it over the way he'd been turning it over all weekend, not trying to make it into more than it was or less than it was, just holding it honestly and seeing what it weighed. It weighed a lot. He was okay with that. November came in hard off the water, the way it did on this coast, cold fronts pushing through every few days and leaving the air stripped clean and smelling of salt and distance. Business at the shop slowed the way it always slowed, after the summer boat traffic ended, which was something Bennett had learned to budget for in his first year and had stopped worrying about in his second. The quieter months gave him time for the longer project's engines that needed full rebuilds, hull work that required multiple days, the kind of careful disassembly and reconstruction that he found more satisfying than the quick seasonal repairs. He drove Sadie to school at 7:30 and was at the shop by 8 and worked until 5 and picked her up from after school and made dinner and helped with homework and watched the news for 20 minutes and went to sleep and did it again. It was the life he'd built. It was still good. But it was different now, in a way he didn't try to articulate. Not worse, different. Like a room that has been slightly rearranged, everything is where it belongs and the function is unchanged. But you're aware of the new arrangement in a way you weren't aware of the old one, because the old one had become invisible through familiarity. He called Aveline on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, usually after Sadie was in bed. She called him on Wednesdays and sometimes Saturday mornings, while Elodie was at the weekly art class she'd been attending since she was 5. They talked about the security audit, which was progressing, and about the board restructuring, which was complicated, and about the federal case against Sutton and Foss, which moved with the glacial deliberateness of federal proceedings and would continue to do so for the foreseeable future. They talked about Sadie's book report, which had received a B+, and which Sadie had analyzed for its qualitative shortcomings with the seriousness of a person receiving quarterly earnings results. They talked about Elodie's art class, where she was apparently producing landscapes that her teacher had described as emotionally mature, which Aveline said proudly, and then immediately second-guessed herself about because she couldn't tell whether. Emotionally mature was a compliment for an 8-year-old. "It's a compliment," Bennett said. "You're sure? It means she's paying attention to what she's looking at instead of what she thinks she's supposed to be looking at. That's the whole job at that age." A pause. "How do you know that?" Sadie went through a phase at 6 where she drew everything the way she thought it looked instead of the way it actually looked. Her teacher said the same thing, and I panicked for about a week, and then she figured it out, and it was fine. He paused. Kids tell you what they're noticing through what they make. If Elodie's landscapes are emotionally mature, she's noticing real things. Another pause. "Do you ever get tired of being right about children?" I'm wrong constantly, he said. You only hear the times I'm right. She laughed. A real one, he'd gotten good at distinguishing her real laugh from the polite professional approximation. The real one was shorter and had a slight roughness to it, like she hadn't expected it. These conversations became the shape of his evenings in November. He didn't examine them too closely. He let them be what they were, which was a thing he was learning to do in ways he hadn't been capable of 8 years ago, when the approach would have been to assess and categorize and plan rather than simply inhabit. Rachel would have approved of that, he thought. She'd spent years trying to get him to inhabit things instead of analyzing them. He thought about Rachel more in November than he had in years, not the grief of her, the raw animal grief that had defined the first 2 years after she died, and the managed, functional grief that had defined the years after that, but her actual self, the way she moved through a room, the way she'd been right about people in the same instinctive, pre-analytical way he was right about threats, a similar mechanism, different application. The way she'd laughed, which was not restrained at all, which was the opposite of Aveline's laugh, but which had been equally real. He talked to Sadie about Rachel more in November too, which surprised them both. He'd always talked to Sadie about her mother, but carefully, in the managed way of a person who wants to do the thing right, and is monitoring himself while doing it. Now it was easier, less managed. He mentioned her the way you mention someone who is gone but present casually, mid-conversation, the way the living stay connected to the dead when the grief has finally metabolized into something workable. Sadie, who was perceptive in ways that occasionally startled him, said one evening, while they were washing dishes, "You seem different." He rinsed a plate. Different how? Less, she thought about it. He's less like you're waiting for something to go wrong. He looked at his daughter. Am I usually like that? Kind of, she said. Not unkindly. You're always watching. Even when nothing is happening. Old habit, he said. I know, she dried a glass. But it's less now. A pause. Is it because of Aveline? He handed her another glass. Probably partly. And the rest? He thought about that honestly. I think I've been waiting for something to go wrong for a long time, he said. Since your mom. And things went wrong at the airport, and we got through it, and they went wrong in other ways, and we got through those too. And I think somewhere in there I started to trust that getting through things was actually possible. Not just theoretically. Actually. Sadie considered this with the focused attention she gave to things that required focused attention. That makes sense, she said. Does it? Yeah, she put the glass away. It's like engines. He looked at her. You say the point of knowing how something breaks is so you can trust it when it's running right, she said. Because you understand the failure modes. She shrugged with one shoulder the way he shrugged. Maybe it's the same. He stood at the kitchen sink with a wet plate in his hand and looked at his daughter, who was 8 years old, and had her mother's smile and his eyes and an analytical intelligence that had apparently been quietly operating at a level he hadn't fully been tracking, and he thought about all the things you pass to a child, without meaning to the fears and the habits and the coping mechanisms, and apparently, occasionally, something useful. Yeah, he said, it's the same. The federal trial date for Gerald Sutton was set for the following spring. The preliminary hearings through November and December produced a steady accumulation of evidence that his legal team contested procedurally and lost procedurally, and the trajectory of the case became increasingly clear to anyone paying attention to. It, which included Aveline's attorneys and the financial press, and notably Drayden Systems, whose board quietly voted to withdraw the merger proposal in December, a move that was reported as a strategic business decision, and was understood by everyone familiar with the situation to be a company distancing itself from a catastrophe. Aveline's company ended the fiscal year stronger than the previous one, which she reported to Bennett on a Thursday evening call with the same matter-of-fact delivery she used for everything, followed immediately by, Elodie lost a tooth. The second one this month. She's treating it as a financial opportunity. Smart, Bennett said. She negotiated, Aveline said. On the rate. Did she win? She always wins, Aveline said. I have no idea where she gets it. He smiled at his ceiling. None at all. Stop, she said. But she was smiling too. He could hear it. The Sutton trial, when it finally convened in April, lasted 11 days and produced a conviction on 4 federal counts, including conspiracy to commit kidnapping, a charge that Sutton's legal team had fought aggressively and lost decisively. Derek Foss, the man in the gray jacket, had pleaded guilty in a separate proceeding 3 months earlier in exchange for a reduced sentence and full testimony against Sutton, which had been among the more significant factors in the outcome. The two secondary board members who had known and said nothing received civil judgments that cost them substantially and professionally. Bennett testified on the 8th day of the trial. He sat in the witness box in a courtroom in Charlotte and answered questions from both sides for 2.5 hours with the same quality of directness he brought to everything plain, specific, without embellishment. He described what he'd seen in the terminal and what he'd done, and what the security footage had shown him, and what the geometry of events had suggested about intent and planning. The prosecutor asked him to walk through the timeline of the checkpoint incident, and he did, step by step, and the courtroom was very quiet while he talked. Aveline was in the courtroom for his testimony. She sat in the gallery with Marcus beside her and her attorney, and Bennett did not look at her while he testified because it would not have been useful. But he was aware of her the way he was aware of most things in a room peripherally, without making it the main focus. When he came out of the witness box, he walked past the gallery on his way to the back of the courtroom, and she caught his eye and gave him a single small nod. He returned it. In the hallway afterward, Marcus shook his hand. He was a compact, gray-haired man in his 50s, with the precise bearing of someone who had once been military and had never fully put it down. His grip was firm, and his eyes were direct and slightly too bright in the specific way of someone who is holding something together in public. "I owe you," Marcus said. "You don't," Bennett said. "I was at the wrong terminal." His jaw tightened. "She was alone for 18 minutes because I was at the wrong terminal. Because someone fed you bad information through a system you had no reason to distrust," Bennett said. "That's not the same thing." Marcus looked at him for a moment. "You know it doesn't feel that way." "I know," Bennett said. "It might not for a while. That's also not the same as being responsible." Marcus nodded slowly. He didn't look entirely convinced. Bennett hadn't expected him to be some things take longer than a conversation to relocate from the place where guilt lives to the place where understanding lives. He knew that from considerable personal experience. Aveline emerged from the courtroom into the hallway, and Marcus excused himself with the professional discretion of a man who had worked for the same person for 6 years and understood which moments were not his to occupy. She looked tired in the specific way of someone who has been present for something necessary and unpleasant and is carrying the accumulated weight of the days it took to get there. "It's done," she said, not triumphantly, just factually. "The verdict's not in yet," Bennett said. "It will be." She said it the way she said things when she'd done the math and was confident in the result. "It will be tomorrow, maybe the day after. And then it's done." He nodded. "How are you?" She thought about it honestly, which was one of the things about her he'd come to rely on. She didn't give reflexive answers to that question. "Relieved," she said. Angry still underneath the relief. "I think the anger is going to take longer." A pause. "And I'm ready to be done talking about Gerald Sutton and start talking about other things." "What other things?" She looked at him. "Elodie wants to come back to Havenport in June. She has opinions about the SEAL's summer behavior that she wants to observe directly. She's written something down. I don't know whether to call it a research proposal or a manifesto." "Tell her June works," he said. "I'll tell her." A pause. "Bennett, I need to ask you something." He waited. "The security consultancy," she said. "The work we've been doing together on the audit and the protocols and the restructuring. You've been good at it. Better than good. And I want to make it formal. Not a salaried position in my company. A proper independent consultancy, with my company as an anchor client. You set the terms, you keep the shop, you keep your life." She paused. "I've drafted a proposal. I want to send it to you." He looked at her. "You drafted a proposal? You're surprised?" "I'm not surprised," he said. He stopped, found the honest version. "I'm figuring out what I think about it. Take the time you need. It's not going anywhere." Another pause. She seemed to carefully choose her next words. "This is a professional offer that stands on its own. It's not contingent on anything else. I want you to be clear about that." He understood what she was doing. She was building him a clear path between the professional and the personal so that neither one was hostage to the other, so that the thing that was developing between them could develop on its own footing without the weight of financial entanglement muddying it. It was a careful and thoughtful thing to do, and it was also a very Aveline Voss thing to do, seeing the structural problem and addressing it directly before it could become a relational problem. "Send me the proposal," he said. "I will." A pause. "Tonight," I figured. She almost smiled. "You know me." Increasingly, he said. He read the proposal that night at the kitchen table. It was thorough and fair, and built with the precision of someone who had been structuring business agreements for a decade. He read it twice and made 3 notes and then set it aside because he'd already decided before he finished the first read. And the second read and the 3 notes were due diligence rather than genuine deliberation. He sat at the table for a while after that in the quiet kitchen and thought about the shape of things. A year earlier, he'd been a marine mechanic in a coastal town with a small shop and a quiet life and very specific walls around it. The walls had been the point, not barriers exactly, more like the carefully maintained boundaries of a life that had been built to contain what it contained and exclude what needed excluding. They'd worked. The life inside them was real and good and his, but walls that are never tested eventually become a different kind of thing. They become the shape of the space you've agreed to live in. And you forget that you built them, that they were a choice, made at a particular time for particular reasons, and that choices made in grief don't have to govern forever. He hadn't understood that until a flight board at Havenport International Airport read the same time twice, and Sadie pulled on his sleeve, and he stood up. He thought about that moment, sometimes not the dramatic parts of what came after, but the moment itself. The decision that wasn't a decision. The way stopping had felt like the obvious next thing. He'd spent time in the months since wondering whether it was his training that had made it obvious or something older and simpler than training. He'd concluded eventually that the distinction didn't matter. Whatever it was that made a person stop instead of walking past, it was either in you or it wasn't, and you either trusted it or you didn't. He'd stopped. Everything else had followed from that. He thought about the 600 people who hadn't stopped. He didn't think about them with contempt. He'd been in crowds himself and understood the weight of other people's urgency, the forward momentum of a busy place, the easy calculus of someone else will handle it, the way self-preservation dressed itself up as reasonableness. He understood all of it. It was human and normal, and also, when he thought about Elodie standing alone for 18 minutes, insufficient. There was something he'd been turning over for months, a thought he'd arrived at not through any deliberate reasoning, but through accumulation, the slow build of small observations over a year of changed life. It was this: the thing that separates the people who stop from the people who don't isn't courage, exactly, and it isn't training, and it isn't exceptional character. It's attention. It's whether you're in the habit of actually looking at what's in front of you, or whether you've learned to process the world at a speed that filters most of it out. He'd spent a decade in the Navy learning to look. Then he'd come home and applied that, looking to engines and tides and his daughter, and the application had been genuine, and the looking had been real. But it had also been narrow. He'd looked closely at the things he'd allowed himself to look at, and had maintained a peripheral blindness to everything outside those careful boundaries. Sadie had called it waiting for something to go wrong. What it had actually been, he understood now, was a kind of careful not looking. A practiced habit of keeping his gaze at a range where what he saw couldn't hurt him more than he'd already been hurt. A frightened 8-year-old had broken through it. Not because she'd done anything exceptional, because she'd simply been there, in the range he'd never entirely stopped watching, the range he couldn't fully close off, no matter how carefully he managed everything else. He was grateful for that, more than he had language for. June arrived with the specific immediate heat of a coastal summer, the humidity coming in off the water and settling over everything like a second atmosphere. The harbor seals were back. Gerald Barnacle, the name having been formally ratified at a ceremony in October that both Sadie and Elodie took very seriously, was the first one back on the dock platform, which Elodie recorded as data in a small notebook she'd brought specifically for the purpose. Day 1 of summer observation, she said, writing. Subject: Gerald Barnacle has returned. Condition: healthy. Disposition: indifferent but consistent. He doesn't know you, Sadie said. He absolutely knows me, Elodie said, not looking up from the notebook. He's choosing not to show it. There's a difference. Sadie looked at Bennett, who was standing behind them with coffee, watching. He shrugged with one shoulder. She shrugged back and accepted the situation. Aveline was on the dock too, a few feet back, reading something on her tablet with the focused half-attention of someone who has tried to take a day off and hasn't entirely succeeded. She'd come down Thursday evening and was staying through Sunday. Bennett had made dinner Thursday, and she'd made dinner Friday, an event that produced considerable amounts of smoke, and a meal that Elodie rated, charitably, as 3 out of 5, and they'd eaten on the dock with the girls and watched the sun go down over the water in the specific companionable quiet of people who had arrived somewhere together without having planned the route. Saturday morning was the seal observation. Saturday afternoon was, According to the schedule, Elodie had actually circulated, on paper, with her name at the top, a kayak trip through the harbor marsh, followed by what was listed as review of findings. She made a schedule, Aveline had said the previous evening. I see that, Bennett said. I don't know where she gets it. You said that about something else once, he said. Did I? The winning negotiations thing. Aveline looked at her daughter. She's going to be terrifying at 35. She's already terrifying at 8, Sadie said, in the dry, fond way she'd developed for discussing Elodie over the past year. The voice of someone who finds a person both exasperating and essential. The kayak trip happened. It was not without incident. Elodie's kayak got hung up twice on marsh grass, and Sadie capsized at the harbor mouth in about 2 feet of water and emerged soaked and furious, and then immediately laughing. And Bennett's paddle developed a crack in the blade around the halfway point that he addressed by switching sides and being more careful. And Aveline, who had kayaked exactly twice before in her life, quietly declined to announce this and simply paid close attention to what everyone else was doing, and managed it with the focused competence of someone who is good at reading situations and adapting to them. She was better at the second half of the trip than the first. He noticed she didn't mention this either. On the way back through the marsh, when the girls were paddling ahead and out of earshot, Aveline said, I have a question. Okay, and I want a direct answer. I know, he said. I always give you a direct answer. You sometimes give me a carefully considered answer that approaches directness, she said. That's different. He thought about that. Fair. She was quiet for a moment, watching Elodie's kayak navigate a bend in the marsh channel with growing confidence. What are we doing? She said. You and I, what is this? He looked at the marsh grass moving in the water. He thought about the carefully considered answer, and he thought about the direct one, and he decided that she'd earned the direct one, fully, without qualifications. I think we're building something, he said, slowly. Because we're both people who built things carefully the first time around and lost them in different ways, and we're not the kind of people who rush. He paused. I think Sadie and Elodie are already there. I think they finished ahead of us. Aveline looked at her daughter paddling around the bend. I think that's right. I'm not good at the early part, he said. The part where things are uncertain and you're supposed to be. He stopped. I don't navigate uncertainty the way most people do. I assess it, I manage it, I'm not good at just sitting in it. I know, she said. I'm not either. I'm also not good at needing things. I built my whole professional identity around not needing things. A pause. I needed you this year. The security work, the consultancy, but more than that. I needed someone who, she stopped. Someone who treated Elodie like she mattered before he knew anything about me. Who treated her like the whole point. She is the whole point, he said. She and Sadie both. Yes, Aveline said, they are. A pause. I need you to know something. He waited. Whatever this is, and wherever it goes, the most important thing it's done is give my daughter a model. Of a man who stops, who notices, who doesn't walk past. Her voice had an evenness to it that he recognized as the controlled version of something deeper. She's going to grow up knowing that exists. That's not a small thing. He thought about that. About Elodie at 8, standing alone in a terminal, and Elodie now paddling a kayak through a marsh with a notebook in the bow for recording seal observations. About the distance between those two versions of the same child and what had happened in between. She's going to be okay, he said. She already is. I know, Aveline said. I just want you to know what it means. To me, to her. He looked at the water for a moment. I know what it means, he said. That's why I stayed. She looked at him. Not at the airport, he said. I mean after. All of it. She held his gaze. Yes, she said quietly. I know. They married 14 months later in October on the dock. Not a large ceremony. 14 people, if you counted the 2 8-year-olds who had strong opinions about the arrangement of the wildflowers and exercised those opinions comprehensively. No television crews, no professional photographers beyond the friend of Aveline's, who had a good camera and was told to just move around and take pictures of whatever looked real. No formal reception with a catered menu and a seating chart. A lunch at the house, tables pushed together, food that Bennett and Marcus and Jim Prater had been preparing since 6 in the morning, which was chaotic in specific and manageable ways. Gerald Barnacle was on the dock platform during this ceremony. This was noted by Elodie, recorded in the notebook, and interpreted as a meaningful presence. Sadie said, specifically, he just lives here. And Elodie said, so do we now. And that ended the debate. The ceremony was short. They'd both wanted it short. Neither of them was a person who needed the extended version of a thing they'd already decided. They said what they meant and signed what they needed to sign, and that was the structure of it, the formal part. And then the 14 people had lunch, and the afternoon went the way good afternoons go, without a schedule. Aveline kept her name professionally. He hadn't expected her to change it and hadn't asked her to. She kept her company, her office in Atlanta, her board. Her life, she restructured none of it. What she restructured was the margins of it, the travel schedule, the habit of working until midnight because there was nothing waiting if she stopped. She came to Havenport on weekends more often than she went back to Atlanta on weekdays. Eventually, the ratio inverted. Eventually, Elodie started at the same school as Sadie, and the commute to Atlanta became the trip to the office rather than the trip home. These transitions happened over months, not days, and they happened imperfectly. There were weeks where Aveline was consumed by something at the company and essentially disappeared into her phone for 72 hours and came out of it depleted and sharp-edged in ways that required patience from everyone, including herself. There were periods where Bennett's habits of self-containment, the instinct to go quiet and internal when things were difficult, instead of talking through them, made her feel like she was trying to have a conversation with a closed door. And she said so, directly, in the way she said everything. And he worked on it. He didn't solve it. He worked on it. They argued about things. About parenting decisions, occasionally, where their instincts were different in ways that required negotiation rather than one person simply being right. About money, specifically about how money moved between them and what that meant. A conversation they had badly the first time, and better the second, and still imperfectly the third. About the consultancy which grew in the first year and required Bennett to travel more than he'd anticipated, which put pressure on things they hadn't fully worked out yet. None of it was smooth. They hadn't expected smooth. They were both people who had spent years managing things and knew what managed things looked like. And what they had was not a managed thing, it was a real thing, which meant it had friction and weight, and moments where the friction and weight were more apparent than the thing itself. And you kept going anyway, because the thing itself was worth it. Sadie and Elodie, for their part, were not a managed thing either. They were a genuine friendship of the specific, deep-rooted variety that forms between children who meet at the exact right moment when one is frightened and alone, and the other simply sits down next to her and offers pretzels without making it complicated. They fought the way people who genuinely care about each other fight badly and quickly, and then completely over it in ways that adults never quite manage. They had separate rooms in the Havenport house, and strong opinions about the decor of each, and a running argument about music that had lasted 2 years and showed no signs of resolution. They were, in the plainest sense, sisters. Not by any legal designation, nobody had applied that word officially, but in the functional daily, unambiguous reality of two people who showed up in each other's lives completely and without reservation, and could not imagine the previous version of their lives as clearly as they could imagine the current one. 3 years after the airport, Elodie asked Bennett why he had stopped. It was an October evening, the 4th October since the airport, and they were on the dock in the early dark, the harbor lights coming on one by one across the water. Elodie was 11 now, and had the particular quality of an 11-year-old who has been paying close attention to the world for several years, and is beginning to form theories about what she's been observing. At the airport, she said, "When I was lost. Why did you stop?" Other people didn't. He thought about it the way he'd thought about it himself many times, arriving at different versions of the answer, depending on what angle he was approaching from. "I had training that made me look at things carefully," he said. "That was part of it. I saw you were in trouble before most people registered it consciously." "But that's not all of it," she said. "Lots of people have training." "No," he said, "it's not all of it. So what's the rest?" He looked at the harbor. A boat was coming in through the mouth, running lights on, moving slow through the calm, dark water. "I think," he said, "that somewhere along the way, son, I learned that the most important things are almost always quiet. They don't announce themselves. A kid standing by an escalator doesn't scream for attention, she just stands there, holding herself together, waiting for someone to actually look." He paused. Most people are moving fast enough that they filter that out. They've trained themselves to only register things that are loud and obvious, because quiet things slow you down. Elodie was quiet for a moment, processing. "And you don't do that?" "I try not to," he said. "I'm not always successful. But I try to stay slow enough to see the quiet things." She thought about that. "Because of the Navy?" "Because of your grandmother," he said. And then, because he rarely talked about Rachel directly with Elodie, and she was old enough now, and he thought she was ready to hear it. Sadie's mom. She moved toward quiet things. It was something I loved about her and tried to learn from her and didn't always manage while she was alive. After she was gone, I understood it better. He paused. She would have stopped, too. She would have stopped faster than I did. Elodie was very still beside him. I didn't know her, she said carefully. No, Bennett said, but Sadie does, in all the ways she carries her without realizing it. They sat with that for a moment. Do you think about her a lot? Elodie said. Sadie's mom. I used to, he said, in the way that hurts. Now I think about her in the way that it's more like carrying something you've learned to carry. It doesn't hurt the same way anymore. It's just part of you. Is that okay? He looked at her. 11 years old, asking him whether it was okay to stop being in pain. Whether arriving somewhere new meant abandoning something old. It was a question that a person 3 times her age might not have known to ask. Yeah, he said. That's exactly what okay looks like. Aveline came out onto the dock then, with 2 mugs, and handed him one without a word, and sat on his other side and looked at the harbor, and for a while none of them said anything. Sadie appeared in the doorway of the house behind them, backlit, and then came down the dock and sat beside Elodie, and the 4 of them were there together in the October dark, with the harbor moving quietly around them, and the boat coming in through the mouth, running lights reflected in the water, finding its way home. This is what Bennett Knox would have told you if you'd asked him then about what he'd learned from the last 3 years of his life, not the dramatic version, not the version with the terminal and the security investigation and the federal trial, but the quieter version underneath all of that the most important decisions you ever make are the ones that don't feel like decisions. They feel like the obvious next thing. They feel like simply doing what is directly in front of you and being present enough to see it. That 4 people, 2 grown and 2 not, all of them carrying things, all of them imperfect, all of them stumbling forward in the specific human way of people, trying to figure out what comes next, can find their way to each other through the smallest act imaginable. One person, stopping, not because he was exceptional, not because he had a plan, because a child was frightened and alone, and he was slow enough to see it, and stopping was the only thing that made any sense. He'd spent a career learning to recognize danger. He'd spent a decade learning to come home. He was still learning, every day, what home actually meant, that it wasn't a place you arrived at permanently. It was something you kept choosing, kept building, kept showing up for in the ordinary daily way that doesn't look like anything from the outside, but is, in fact, everything. The boat came through the harbor mouth and slowed to its berth. The running lights went off. The dark settled back in around the dock, comfortable and known. And Bennett Knox, who had once stood in the loudest airport on the East Coast and chosen to be quiet enough to see one small frightened girl, sat with his family in the October night and was, without drama and without ceremony, and with all the imperfect reality that the word contains, exactly where he was supposed to be.